They laughed when he paid $500 for 5 broken electric cars that nobody wanted. They laughed when he towed them through the rain like a man hauling his own funeral. Victoria Sterling, CEO of one of the most powerful automotive companies in America, laughed loudest of all. She said he'd bought himself 5 tons of regret. What she didn't know, what none of them understood standing in that parking lot with their expensive umbrellas and their expensive contempt, was that Ethan Cross hadn't bought scrap metal. He'd bought the future, and it was going to cost her everything. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one's going to take a while. The auction was held on a Tuesday in mid-November, which meant Detroit was doing what Detroit does in November, punishing everyone who hadn't left yet. Rain came sideways off Lake Erie, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck no matter how you angle yourself against it. The parking lot behind the Kellerman Industrial Liquidation Facility on East McNichols Road was a slab of cracked asphalt roughly the size of a football field, and by 9 in the morning it had turned into a shallow gray lake, interrupted by orange safety cones and the boots of about 60 people who had decided, for various reasons, that wet Tuesday mornings at industrial auctions were worth their time. Most of them were professionals. You could tell by the way they moved, slow, unhurried, hands in their pockets, eyes doing the real work. Salvage dealers, parts brokers, a couple of academic types with lanyards and clipboards who looked like they'd wandered off a university campus and hadn't quite figured out they were in the wrong place. 3 men from a recycling consortium who kept huddled together like they were sharing body heat, which they probably were. And then there was Ethan Cross, who was none of those things. He was 34, medium height, with the kind of build that comes not from a gym, but from 20 years of actually using your body for work. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, with hands that were clean now because he'd scrubbed them 3 times that morning, but still held that permanent faint darkness in the creases that no amount of soap ever fully removes. He wore a canvas work jacket that had been waterproofed once and wasn't anymore, and boots that were good boots. Red Wings, 8 years old, resoled twice. And he stood at the far edge of the lot looking at the 5 vehicles lined up under a corrugated aluminum awning like they were something he recognized, which in a way they were. The cars didn't look like much. That was probably the most accurate thing you could say about them. They were electric vehicle prototypes. The documentation listed them as Sterling Automotive Model EP7 developmental units, manufacturing dates between 4 and 6 years prior, decommissioned and transferred to corporate surplus 18 months ago. They had the general shape of a mid-size sedan, something aerodynamic in ambition, if not in execution, with the flat hood and flush door handles and low ground clearance that signaled electric architecture. But that's where the positive description ended. Unit 1 had been in a collision at some point. The entire front fascia was caved in, and someone had zip-tied a piece of plastic sheeting over the shattered windshield so the interior wouldn't flood. Unit 2 looked structurally intact but had been stripped of its battery module completely, leaving an open cavity in the undercarriage that you could stick your arm through up to the elbow. Unit 3 had surface rust starting along the rocker panels and wheel arches that suggested moisture intrusion in the storage facility. Never a good sign with electronics. Unit 4's driver's side door was missing entirely. Unit 5 was the most complete of the group, but had burn scoring along the rear quarter panel, the kind that comes from an electrical fire that was caught before it became catastrophic. Ethan walked the line 3 times. He wasn't taking notes. He was looking. The auction itself was being managed by a field representative from Kellerman named Bryce, who had the permanently overwhelmed look of a man handling 17 things at once. He'd set up a folding table with a laptop and a PA system with one speaker that kept cutting out, and he was trying to conduct a running commentary on the lots while also fielding calls on his cell phone and keeping an eye on a group of salvage dealers who kept trying to pick up and physically examine items that were marked "Do Not Handle." Lot 47, the 5 EP7 units, was scheduled for 10:15. By 10 o'clock, Ethan was standing near the awning with a coffee he'd bought from a cart outside the facility, and he was aware that he was not the only person paying attention to the cars, but he was the only one paying attention to the right things.
2 salvage dealers had walked the line already and dismissed it. He'd overheard one of them, heavy-set guy in a yellow rain slicker, tell his partner that the battery architecture was proprietary and outdated and not worth the teardown cost, that you'd spend more in labor pulling the components than you'd recover selling them. The other one had shrugged and agreed. They'd moved on to a lot of machine shop equipment 3 rows over. What the man in the yellow slicker had noticed was the battery module in Unit 2 was missing and the others were damaged. What he hadn't noticed, or had noticed and not understood, was that each of the 5 cars was missing something different. Unit 1's battery was present, but the thermal regulation subsystem was destroyed. Unit 2 was stripped, but its thermal architecture was intact and visible, partially dismantled, but with its core configuration identifiable. Unit 3 had rocker panel rust, but the battery module was sealed and dry and potentially viable. Unit 4, the one missing the door, had what looked like a complete drive unit. Unit 5, the burned one, had burn scoring only on the exterior. Ethan had been working with electric vehicle systems for 9 years. The first 4 at a dealership service center, the last 5 at his own shop. Cross-motion garage, 1,800 square feet on Livernois Avenue, 2 hoists, 1 employee, and a reputation among the kind of customers who couldn't afford dealership rates but needed their vehicles actually fixed rather than just invoiced. He knew Sterling Automotive's EP7 program, the way you know something you read about when it was still news. The project had been announced with significant fanfare approximately 6 years ago. Sterling's entry into the performance electric vehicle market, promising range and charge cycle numbers that would have leapfrogged anything then available. It had been canceled 18 months later, officially due to strategic realignment of capital priorities, which was the kind of language corporations use when they want to describe a failure without using that word. The automotive press had run a few postmortems. The consensus was thermal management failure. The battery systems were running too hot under performance loads, degrading faster than acceptable margins, and Sterling's engineering team hadn't been able to solve it within the program's budget window. The project had been shuttered, the prototypes decommissioned, and Victoria Sterling had pivoted the company toward a licensing arrangement with a Korean battery supplier that everyone agreed was the safe play. Ethan had read those articles. He'd read them carefully, the way you read something when you're trying to figure out what the person writing it doesn't know. What he was looking at now, standing in the rain with his coffee going cold, was 5 vehicles that had been built in a sequence. Not as 5 separate test units running parallel trials, which was the standard interpretation and the one the press had used. As a series. Unit 1's thermal system was destroyed, but it was the first iteration, the proof of concept that burned itself up, proving the concept worked. Unit 2 had been stripped of its battery because someone had pulled it to examine what went wrong with Unit 1. Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 5, each one was a revision. Each one was fixing something the previous unit had broken. Whoever ran this program hadn't failed. They'd been 3 to 4 months from something significant when the plug got pulled. Ethan finished his coffee and threw the cup in a bin near the folding table and waited for lot 47. He almost didn't notice her arrive. The convoy was hard to miss in retrospect. 3 black SUVs pulling into the lot at 10:08, parking in a row along the east fence with the kind of deliberate positioning that suggested the drivers had been instructed to park in a row along the east fence. 6 people got out. 4 of them were staff of various kinds. Assistants, a man with a tablet, a woman who appeared to be there primarily to hold an umbrella over the 5th person. The 5th person was Victoria Sterling. Ethan knew who she was because her face had been on the cover of 4 trade publications in the past 2 years, and because Sterling Automotive's headquarters was 12 miles from where he was standing. She was 51, though she looked older in the way that powerful people sometimes do. Not aged so much as hardened, like wood that's been kiln-dried too fast. She was dressed for the rain in a coat that probably cost more than a month of his rent, and she moved through the lot with the practiced efficiency of someone who considers their time to be a depletable resource. Behind her, slightly back and to the left, was a man Ethan didn't recognize. Late 40s, silver at the temples, dressed well in the way of men who've spent a career being photographed. He walked with the comfortable authority of someone who'd had authority long enough that it had become physical,
embedded in his posture. Victoria Sterling stopped in front of the 5 EP7 units. She looked at them for approximately 15 seconds. Then she said something to the man beside her, too low for Ethan to catch, and the man smiled, a quick and private smile, and they both moved on toward the main auction area. The man with the tablet peeled off toward Bryce at the folding table. Some kind of conversation happened. Bryce nodded twice and typed something. Ethan watched all of this and then looked back at the cars. Lot 47, Bryce announced at 10:17, his voice fighting through the bad speaker. 5 EP7 developmental units, decommissioned Sterling Automotive Prototype Series. Vehicles are as is, where is, no warranty or representation. Documentation available at the table. Starting bid is $250. There was a brief general silence. Then someone laughed. Not unkindly, exactly. More like the involuntary response you get when something confirms what you expected. $250 for all 5? Someone called from the back. Is the lot including the puddles? More laughter. Bryce managed a professional smile and repeated the starting bid. Ethan raised his number card. $250. He said it at normal volume, clearly, without drama. He wasn't performing anything. He meant it. $250 to the gentleman in the canvas jacket, Bryce said. Do I hear 300? Silence. The salvage dealers had moved on. The academic types were conferring over their clipboards about a lot of test equipment further down. The recycling consortium guys weren't interested in vehicles. 300? Bryce tried. Nothing. Going once at $250. 500. The voice came from behind Ethan and to his left. He turned. The man with the silver temples was standing about 20 feet away with his arms crossed, and his tablet man beside him. He was looking at Ethan, not at Bryce, and his expression was the expression of a man who is performing a transaction he finds mildly contemptible. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Bryce. 500, he said. From me. Bryce blinked. Sir, there's already a bid of 500 from... I'm raising it, Ethan said. 500 from me. It wasn't a raise, it matched the number. Bryce opened his mouth and closed it again, genuinely uncertain about auction protocol in this specific circumstance, which was fair because the circumstance was unusual. The gentleman with the... Bryce looked at Silver Temples. Sir, are you bidding 600? Silver Temples glanced toward the main auction area, where Victoria Sterling had her back to this entire proceeding. He looked back at Ethan. Something crossed his face. Not anger exactly, more like the look you get when you've been asked to swat a fly and the fly turned and looked at you. No, he said. We're good. Going once at 500, Bryce said, with palpable relief. Going twice. Sold for $500. He had his truck there, a 2009 Ram 2500 with a flatbed trailer he'd borrowed from his friend Marcus, who ran a small equipment rental operation out of a warehouse on Gratiot Avenue. The trailer was rated for 15,000 pounds. 5 EP7 units fully loaded was going to push that, but Marcus had looked at Ethan's math and said the frame would hold if Ethan drove slow and didn't hit anything, which Ethan intended to do. He was hitching the first unit, using a come-along and some carefully placed wooden blocks under the front subframe because the unit with the missing nose had compromised jacking points, when he became aware that he had an audience. It had started as a small thing. 2 of the remaining auction-goers had wandered over to watch, more out of boredom than anything else. Then Bryce had come over because he needed to confirm the paperwork and ended up staying. Then 3 more people. By the time Ethan had the first unit positioned on the trailer and was heading back for the second, there were maybe 15 people watching, and the watching had become the kind of watching that carries with it a shared subtext, which was, what exactly does this man think he's doing? He heard the click of heels on wet asphalt before he heard the voice. What's your plan for these? He straightened up. Victoria Sterling was standing 6 feet away. The umbrella woman was behind her. Silver Temples, who Ethan had pieced together was probably a Sterling executive of some kind, was off to the side with his phone out, but not looking at his phone. She was looking at the cars, not at Ethan. The way she'd looked at the cars before, That quick, dismissive 15-second inspection was different from how she was looking at them now. Now she was looking at them the way people look at things they've already decided about and are checking to make sure they're still decided. "Rebuild them," Ethan said. She looked at him. It was a controlled kind of look, the look of someone accustomed to managing rooms of people who need to be managed, applied to a man in a wet canvas jacket who had just bought her company's failed prototypes for $500. "Rebuild them," she repeated. "Yes." "Into what?" "Into what they were supposed to be." A pause. She tilted her head very slightly. Not a sign of consideration, he thought. More a mannerism she'd developed to signal that she was giving something more attention than it deserved. "Mr. Cross. Ethan Cross. Mr. Cross." She said it with the particular neutral courtesy of someone about to say something discourteous. Those vehicles represent 4 years of work by a team of 32 engineers and a research budget of approximately $70 million. They failed. Comprehensively. The thermal management system was fundamentally flawed, and we could not correct it within any reasonable... "The thermal management system in Unit 1 failed," Ethan said. "Unit 2's thermal system is intact. Dismantled, but intact." She stopped. He kept his voice even. He wasn't arguing. He was stating something he'd noticed, the way you state something factual. Each of these vehicles is missing something different. The program didn't fail comprehensively. It was terminated before the engineering team finished integrating what they'd learned from each unit into a single build. Unit 5 is closest. You can see it in the wire routing on the rear charge subsystem. Behind her, Silver Temples had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Victoria Sterling looked at Ethan for a long moment. Long enough that the umbrella woman started to look uncertain about where to position herself. Then Victoria smiled. It was a brief, controlled smile, and it didn't reach anything above her cheeks. "Mr. Cross, you've bought 5 cars for $500. I'm sure that feels significant." She glanced at the cars one more time. "Good luck with your project." She turned and walked back toward the SUVs. Silver Temples lingered for a moment. He looked at Ethan, the way you look at a puzzle that doesn't have the piece you need, and then he followed her. Laughter drifted back from the group. Not cruel exactly. The released tension kind of laughter that happens when something strange and slightly uncomfortable resolves itself without incident. Someone said, loud enough to carry, $500. Man's got ambition. Someone else, man's got 5 broke cars. More laughter. Ethan went back to the come-along and kept working. It took him 4 hours to load all 5 units, working mostly alone. Marcus had sent a guy named Deshawn to help. But Deshawn's help consisted primarily of handing Ethan tools and providing commentary, which was still help. The rain never stopped. By 2 in the afternoon, Ethan was soaked through the jacket and his boots had given up any pretense of being waterproof, and he was tired in the specific way you get tired from cold, wet, repetitive physical work, which is a different kind of tired than any other. He drove back to Livernois at 30 miles an hour on surface streets, which is the kind of thing that generates a minor convoy of impatient Detroit drivers behind you if you're not careful. He was careful. He took the route he'd planned that morning, the one that avoided the worst of the potholes and the overpass with the bad clearance, and he got all 5 units to the garage without losing anything. He didn't unload them that night. He sat in his truck in the parking area behind the shop and ate a sandwich he'd bought from the gas station on Fenkel and looked at the 5 cars on the trailer in the yellow overhead light, and he let himself think about it clearly for the first time since the morning. He didn't have $70 million. He didn't have 32 engineers. He had 1,800 square feet, 2 hoists, 9 years of experience with electric vehicle systems, and enough welding and fabrication knowledge to make things from other things. He had a pretty good understanding of battery thermal management because he'd developed it out of necessity. A lot of his customers were early EV adopters who'd bought first-generation electric vehicles that the dealers didn't know how to service, and he'd spent 3 years learning those systems the hard way, meaning through failure and correction and failure again. He had 5 cars that contained between them something that 32 engineers and $70 million had gotten 90% of the way to building. He sat there for a while. Then he went inside and made himself coffee and started writing down everything he'd observed about each unit. He filled 7 pages before he went to sleep. His shop was called Cross Motion Garage. and it had been called that for 5 years, since he'd signed the lease on the Livernois space at 30 in what you could generously call an act of optimism, and what his mother had called something more direct. The neighborhood wasn't bad and wasn't good. It was the kind of Detroit block that had been through several versions of itself and hadn't quite settled on the current one. There was a tire shop 2 doors down run by a man named Gerald, who'd been there for 22 years and who Ethan had a standing arrangement with for alignment work. There was a Coney Island on the corner that was open until 2 a.m. and that Ethan had eaten at, by his rough estimate, somewhere between 400 and 500 times. There was a vacant lot across the street that had been a vacant lot for as long as anyone Ethan knew could remember, and which became, in summer, a small informal community gathering space that nobody had organized and nobody needed to. Inside, the shop was clean in the way that working spaces are clean. Not antiseptic, not staged, but organized in a way that made sense to the person who worked there. Tools hung on pegboard by type and size. The floor got swept every evening. The hoists were maintained on a schedule Ethan had written out and laminated and posted on the wall beside the breaker panel. There was a workbench along the north wall that held the parts for whatever was currently in progress, and a laptop that was 4 years old and ran slower than it used to but still ran, which Ethan considered an adequate description of several things in his life. His one employee was a young woman named Priya Nair, who had come to him 2 years ago with a 6-month certificate in automotive technology from a community college program and a clear gap between what the certificate had taught her and what she could actually do. Ethan had hired her because she'd asked the right question during the interview, which was, "What's the most complicated job you've done this year and what went wrong with it?" He'd told her, and she'd listened carefully, and then she'd asked a follow-up question that showed she'd actually understood the answer. That was the interview. She'd been there since, and she was good. She learned fast, she asked before touching anything she wasn't sure about, and she had the patience for diagnostic work that most people don't. The ability to stay with a problem that isn't resolving without getting frustrated and guessing. Ethan told Priya about the 5 cars the morning after he brought them home. He told her while they were both standing at the workbench with coffee, and he laid out the 7 pages of notes, and he walked her through what he'd observed about each unit. She read the notes. She looked up. She said, "That's a lot of work." "Yes, for one person." "2 people." She looked at him. "I have to keep doing regular jobs. We have regular jobs. We have like a schedule." "I know. I'm not saying no." She set down the notes. "I'm saying we need to talk about how we do both things." That conversation took most of that morning and resulted in a schedule that was, on paper, manageable, and that both of them suspected would become less manageable as the project developed. But it was a starting point, and they both understood that starting points don't need to be perfect. The first 2 weeks were assessment. Ethan pulled every access panel on every car. He photographed everything. He mapped the wiring harnesses unit by unit, building a picture of where each car's architecture diverged from the others and what those divergences meant. He pulled samples from the battery cells in units 1, 3, 4, and 5, the ones with battery modules present, and ran capacity and impedance tests. He pulled the thermal regulation hardware from Unit 2 and laid it out on the workbench piece by piece. He found what he'd expected to find, which was confirmation. And he found some things he hadn't expected, which is what happens when you move from theory to physical evidence. The confirmation was this: the EP7 program had been using a liquid cooling architecture for thermal management, coolant channels integrated into the battery module structure, circulating fluid to draw heat away from the cells during high-load discharge. It was a standard approach, mature technology, and the Sterling team had pushed it hard. The channel density in Unit 1's thermal system was aggressive, trying to get more cooling capacity than the architecture efficiently allowed. Unit 1 had overheated during a high-performance test, the kind of failure that damages cells and triggers shutdown protocols, and in this case had also caused localized thermal runaway in 2 of the modules, which was the electrical fire that had left the burn scoring on, Ethan checked his notes, actually on Unit 3, not Unit 5. He'd had them confused initially. Unit 3's battery was sealed and viable, But the fire scoring on the exterior had come from the thermal event during the test. Unit 5's burn was something different, a wiring fault in the charge controller, unrelated to the battery thermal issue probably. The unexpected finding was Unit 2. He'd assumed, based on the physical condition and the fact that the battery had been pulled, that Unit 2 was the earliest iteration, the one they'd sacrificed for study. But when he mapped the wire harnesses and cross-referenced the build documentation he'd received with the auction purchase, he found that Unit 2 was actually the fourth car built. Someone had pulled the battery intentionally for a reason that wasn't documented in the lot materials. And the thermal architecture in Unit 2 wasn't liquid cooling. It was a hybrid system. Liquid cooling in the cell modules, yes, but with a secondary layer he hadn't seen before. Phase change material integrated into the module housing, the kind of thing that absorbs heat through a material state change rather than fluid flow. It was more complex to manufacture, more expensive to engineer, but it was also potentially more effective at exactly the kind of high-demand thermal situation that had killed Unit 1. He sat with that for a full day before he said anything to Priya. When he did, he showed her the cross-section diagrams he'd sketched from what he'd pulled apart, and she said, "That's not standard." And he said, "No." And she said, "Did they know it worked?" And he said, "I don't think they got to find out." "But you think it does?" "I think it does if the phase change material is the right compound and the integration geometry is right. How do you test that without building a full system?" "You build a partial system," he said. "You mock up the critical section, run simulated load profiles through it, measure the thermal response." "How long does that take?" "If it goes well?" He looked at the sketches. 6 weeks? It took 10. There's a kind of work that doesn't look like progress from the outside, where you're doing the same thing repeatedly and getting wrong answers and adjusting and doing it again, and each wrong answer is actually information, but from a distance, what you look like is a person who keeps failing. The 10 weeks of bench testing were that kind of work. Ethan built the test rig himself, a steel frame, a load simulation module he'd cobbled from salvaged battery components, and a programmable discharge controller he'd bought, used from an EV battery development company that was clearing out old equipment. Priya helped him wire it and helped him develop the test protocol. They ran the first simulation on a February evening, and it failed inside 8 minutes. The phase change material he'd sourced, a commercially available paraffin compound, had the right thermal properties in theory, but the wrong viscosity behavior during transition, which meant it wasn't distributing heat laterally through the module housing the way the geometry required. He ordered different material. He waited 2 weeks for it to arrive. He ran the second test. Different failure mode. Priya started keeping a failure log because Ethan would forget the specific numbers if he didn't write them down. And the numbers mattered. Each failure was a data point. The data points were building towards something. "You okay?" Priya asked him once, around week 7, when he'd come in and looked at the test rig for a full minute before speaking. It was a Tuesday. They'd gotten a bad result the previous Friday, and he'd spent the weekend thinking. "Yeah," he said. "You don't have to be." He looked at her. She was 26 and serious in the way of people who take things seriously without broadcasting it. "I'm okay," he said. "I just need to rethink the channel geometry on the secondary layer." "I was going to say the same thing. What did you come up with?" "I think we need tighter spacing in the center sections and wider relief near the module edges." "Why wider at the edges?" "Because the lateral distribution problem isn't happening uniformly. It's happening more at the corners, where the geometry is already fighting the material behavior. If you give it more room at the edge, the center gets more aggressive distribution." He thought about it. "That might work?" "Might. Might is where we are." She nodded. "Might is fine." The test they ran with the revised geometry in week 9 showed a 17% improvement in thermal distribution uniformity. The test in week 10, with a further refinement to the secondary layer channel depth, held through a 40-minute high-load simulation without significant temperature deviation. Ethan ran the same test 3 more times that week, at different times of day, to control for ambient temperature variation. All 3 held. He didn't celebrate. He sat at the workbench with the data printouts and read through them carefully, looking for the place where he was wrong.
Priya came over and stood beside him. "This is it," she said. "It looks like it." "It is it." He set down the printouts. Outside it was March, and Detroit was doing what Detroit does in March, which is pretending that winter might be over while absolutely not guaranteeing anything. "Now I have to build it into an actual car," he said. "Yeah." Priya picked up the printouts and straightened them. "So, that does."
The build phase was different from the bench work, messier, more physical, less controlled. Ethan had decided to work with Unit 5 as the primary donor vehicle, partly because it was the most complete structurally, and partly because the burn damage on the exterior was cosmetic, and the charge controller fault he'd traced was fixable. Unit 2's thermal architecture would be the basis for the new system. Units 1 and 3 would donate battery cells. He'd tested all of them, found the viable ones, and mapped out a configuration that gave him the capacity and cycle characteristics he needed. Unit 4's drive unit would replace Unit 5's, because Unit 5's drive unit had bearing wear that would have needed addressing anyway. What he was building was, essentially, the 6th car. The one the program would have built if it had kept going. He talked to Marcus about money, because money was the other problem. The parts he needed, the phase change compound and quantity, fabrication materials for the new thermal module housings, a handful of electronic components that had to be sourced new, were going to cost somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000, which was real money in a shop that ran on margins that didn't allow for a lot of real money. Marcus was a practical man with a practical man's relationship to risk. He listened to Ethan explain the project across a folding table at Marcus's warehouse on a Saturday afternoon, with Marcus's 2 sons intermittently running through the warehouse on some child mission while their mother periodically appeared in the doorway and told them to knock it off. "How sure are you?" Marcus asked. "About the thermal system? Pretty sure. The benchwork held. About the rest of it?" Ethan thought about the rest of it. "Not as sure. The integration is complicated. There are at least 3 things I haven't solved yet." "What happens if you can't solve them?" "Then I have an interesting car that doesn't work." Marcus's son ran through again, chased by his younger brother. Marcus watched them and then looked back at Ethan. "What happens if you can solve them?" "Then I have something that doesn't exist yet." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll lend you $20,000. You pay me back at the rate the shop can manage. No schedule I'm going to hold you to, just pay it back." Ethan looked at him. "Why?" "Because you bought 5 broke cars in the rain, and you've been working on them for 3 months, and you haven't quit." Marcus shrugged. "And because I know you. You don't say pretty sure about things you're not pretty sure about." Ethan paid Marcus back 14 months later, ahead of the schedule neither of them had technically set. But that's not the part of the story they were in right now, Sherpa. Quote, "The fabrication work started in April and ran through July. Building the new thermal module housings required a level of precision fabrication that was at the edge of what his shop could do. He ended up contracting parts of it to a small machine shop in Hamtramck, whose owner, a man named Vitold, who'd been doing precision machining for 30 years, took one look at the drawings and asked enough sharp questions that Ethan spent 2 hours explaining the project before Vitold agreed to take the work. Vitold kept asking questions after that, texting Ethan sometimes in the evening with follow-up thoughts about tolerances and material behavior, and eventually Ethan invited him to the shop, and Vitold came and looked at the car and the bench testing setup, and didn't say anything for a while, and then said, "This is interesting work," in a tone that from Vitold meant approximately what standing applause means from someone else. The integration problems Ethan had mentioned to Marcus were real. The first was the battery configuration. Getting the salvage cells arranged in the module structure he'd designed required solving a communication problem between cells from 2 different production runs, since Units 1 and 3 had been built with the same base cell design but different firmware iterations in the battery management chips. He solved it by writing a translation layer, which was not something he'd done before, and which required him to learn considerably more about battery management firmware than he'd previously known. He learned it. It took 3 weeks and several conversations with an online community of EV enthusiasts and developers whose collective knowledge base was, he found, genuinely impressive. The second problem was the drive unit integration. Unit 4's drive unit was physically compatible with Unit 5's mounting points, But the power electronics interface was a generation different, and getting them to talk to each other required either a commercial adapter that didn't exist or building a custom interface board. He built the custom interface board. Priya helped. It took 2 weeks and 3 prototype boards before they had one that was stable. The third problem was the charge controller. He'd identified the fault in Unit 5's original controller early on. It was a component failure in the thermal cutoff circuit, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and isn't anyone's fault, but replacing it turned out to involve a cascade of other small incompatibilities between the new thermal system and the original control logic. He ended up rewriting the thermal management software from the ground up, working from the hardware specifications he'd documented during the bench phase, and building a control architecture that was native to the new system rather than adapted from the old one. That part took 6 weeks and was the part that almost broke him. Not broke him in a dramatic way, just ground him down. It was August by then, and the shop was hot, and he was sleeping badly, and there were 3 regular customers whose work he was behind on because the EP7 project kept absorbing time he'd allocated elsewhere. He and Priya had a sharp argument one Thursday afternoon about scheduling, the kind of argument where both people are right and neither person has a good solution and you both know it, and which ended with Priya going home early and Ethan sitting alone in the shop until 11 working on the control logic and getting nowhere. He called his mother that night. She lived in Inkster, 20 minutes west, and she was 71 and sharp and had no patience for self-pity, which was one of the reasons he called her when things were hard. "You're stuck," she said, "on the control software." "What are you getting wrong?" "I don't know yet." "Then how do you know you're getting it wrong?" "Because it doesn't work." She was quiet. He could hear the television in the background. She kept it on low, always. "What does it do when it doesn't work?" He explained. She listened, and she didn't understand most of the technical specifics and didn't pretend to. But she asked questions that weren't technical, questions about sequence and logic and cause and effect. And somewhere in the process of answering her questions, he found the part he'd been getting wrong. He stayed up until 3 in the morning writing the corrected logic. It worked on the first test run. He never told her that. He told her later that things had gotten better, which was true, and she said, "They usually do," which was also true, and they talked about other things for a while. The first full system integration test was in September. He'd gone back and forth about whether to run it at night when the shop was cooler and there were fewer distractions, or during the day when there was more light and Priya was there. He decided on a Saturday morning, 9 a.m., partly because Priya had asked to be there and partly because the weekend gave him a full day to deal with whatever went wrong. Nothing went catastrophically wrong. It was more complicated than that. The car ran. The battery management system initialized correctly. The thermal management system, his thermal system, the one that had taken 10 weeks of bench testing and 6 weeks of control software and 4 months of build work and Marcus's $20,000, came online and registered temperature profiles within the margins he'd calculated. The drive unit engaged. The car moved under its own power slowly in a straight line across the shop floor until the front tires hit the drain gutter and stopped it. Priya said, "Okay." Ethan said, "Yeah." "That's it actually working." "That's it actually working." She looked at him. He looked at the car. It was still shaped like something that had been in a collision and been rebuilt in a small shop by 2 people with limited resources. The gaps weren't perfect. Some of the panel work he'd done was workmanlike rather than beautiful, and the exterior still wore the evidence of its history in ways that a professional body shop would spend weeks correcting. But it ran, and the temperatures were right. He put the car on the hoist that afternoon and went through every accessible connection. He found 2 that had micro-movement under vibration load that he wasn't satisfied with and reseated them. He went home and slept for 11 hours. By October, he had logged approximately 400 miles on the car through a combination of low-speed shop testing and eventually actual road use. He had a buddy at a fleet testing facility outside Ann Arbor who had let him run some instrumented tests on a closed track in exchange for fixing the buddy's truck, and those tests had given him data. Real data, controlled and documented, the kind that meant something. The thermal management system held through everything he threw at it. high-load performance runs, sustained highway speed, cold-soaked start cycles in overnight temperatures. A charging session that he deliberately pushed past normal termination protocols to see how the system responded to overcharged stress. The range numbers were, and he had run these 3 times because the first time he'd thought he'd made an error, better than anything in the current market. Not marginally better, significantly better. The combination of the optimized cell configuration, the thermal management allowing the cells to operate in a narrower and more efficient temperature range, and the revised drive unit control software had produced efficiency numbers that put the car in a category by itself. He sat at his workbench in the second week of October with the test documentation laid out in front of him, and he understood, clearly and without drama, what he had. He also understood that he had no idea what to do with it. He was a mechanic. He had a small shop on Livernois Avenue. He'd built something remarkable in the space between regular jobs, using borrowed money and salvaged parts, and a lot of hours he hadn't been sleeping. He didn't have a patent attorney. He didn't have a business development person. He didn't have, as far as he could identify, any obvious path from where he was to anywhere that the thing in front of him could actually matter. He pulled out his phone and called Priya because she was 26 and thought about things differently than he did. "So," he said when she picked up, "we need to talk about what happens next." She was quiet for a second. "I've been thinking about that. And I think we need to show someone who can't pretend they don't see it." "Who?" "That's what I've been working on," she said. "I have some thoughts. You want to hear them now or in the morning?" He looked at the test data. He looked at the car on the hoist. Unit 5, rebuilt from salvage, towed through November rain, taken apart and put back together, and taken apart and put back together again, now sitting in his shop with 400 miles on it, and performance numbers that shouldn't exist. "In the morning," he said. "I'm going to sleep." He didn't sleep for a while. He sat there a bit longer. Then he turned off the lights and locked up and drove home, and the streets were quiet, and the city was dark, and somewhere 12 miles away in a building on Jefferson Avenue, 32 engineers' worth of abandoned work was about to start making noise. Priya's thoughts, as it turned out, were more developed than she'd let on over the phone. She came in the next morning with a printed list, actual paper, printed and folded in her jacket pocket, and she set it on the workbench beside Ethan's coffee and let him read it while she got her own coffee from the machine in the back corner that had been making a grinding noise for 6 months and that neither of them had gotten around to replacing. The list had 12 names on it, engineers mostly. 2 academics from the University of Michigan's Automotive Research Department, a woman named Dr. Celine Akar, who ran an independent EV systems evaluation consultancy out of Ann Arbor, a former Ford powertrain director who'd retired and now did private consulting. 3 journalists, all of them in the technical automotive space rather than the general business press. "We don't go to investors first," Priya said, sitting across from him. "We go to people who can evaluate what we actually built, people with credentials that matter. If they say it works, everyone else has to take it seriously." Ethan looked at the list. "How do we get these people to come to a shop on Livernois Avenue? We don't lead with the shop. What do we lead with?" "The data." She reached into her jacket and produced a second sheet. The summary page from the Ann Arbor track testing, the one with the efficiency numbers and the thermal profiles. "We send the data first. We say we have an independent verification request for an electric vehicle system with novel thermal management architecture. We don't say who we are or where we're based until they ask. And when they ask, then we tell them. And by then, they've already seen the numbers, and they're already curious." Ethan looked at the data sheet. He'd looked at it dozens of times. It still didn't entirely feel real. "Some of them are going to think it's faked." "Yeah, that's why we need the ones who'll come anyway, to check. The ones who see numbers like this and think I need to verify this myself instead of this is impossible." He nodded slowly. He thought about Dr. Celine Akar, whose name he recognized. She'd written 2 papers on battery thermal management that he'd read during the bench testing phase, papers that were technically rigorous in a way that distinguished them from a lot of the academic EV literature. If Celine Akar looked at the data and came to Livernois Avenue, that meant something. "Who do we start with?" he asked. "Her."
Priya tapped Akar's name. She's the hardest to convince, which means if she comes, everybody else follows. Ethan picked up the data sheet and his coffee and sat with both for a moment. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, October doing its slow, reluctant turn toward November, and a truck went by on Livernois heavy enough to rattle the shop windows. Normal Tuesday sounds, a Tuesday on which he was apparently going to try to get a credentialed EV systems researcher to take a phone call about a car he'd built in his garage. "Okay," he said, "let's write the email." It took them most of the morning to write a single page, not because they were slow, because every sentence required a decision about how much to say and how to say it, and the wrong call in any direction meant either giving too little to generate interest or giving too much and sounding like exactly the kind of overconfident amateur claim that serious researchers had learned to filter into the trash. The final version was formal, specific, and sparse. It described the system architecture in correct technical language. It attached 3 charts from the track data. It asked for 15 minutes of Dr. Akar's time for a preliminary technical discussion and noted that full verification data and physical access to the vehicle could be made available upon request. Priya sent it from a new email address they'd set up under Cross Motion Research, which was not a legal entity yet, but which sounded like it could be. Dr. Akar replied in 4 hours. Her reply was 6 words. "This data is worth discussing. Call me." Ethan read it twice. Priya read it over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Priya said, "Told you. You told me she was the hardest." And she replied in 4 hours. So now imagine the others. The call with Selin Akar lasted 92 minutes. Ethan had expected skepticism, methodical, technical skepticism of the kind that researchers deploy not to dismiss but to test, to probe for the weak point in what you're claiming. He got it. She went through the thermal profile data chart by chart and asked questions that were sharp enough that twice he had to pull up his bench test documentation on the laptop while they were talking to give her the specific numbers she needed. She asked about the phase change compound selection, about the channel geometry rationale, about how he'd handled the cell communication issue between the 2 production-run batteries. She asked about the control software logic, and he explained it, and she was quiet for a moment and then asked a follow-up question that indicated she'd understood the approach and was testing a specific assumption embedded in it. At the end, she said, "I want to see the car." "When? What's your schedule?" "I'm available whenever you can come." Another pause. He could hear her thinking, not literally, but the kind of silence that has texture in it. "Next Friday. I'm bringing a colleague. Is that acceptable?" "Yes." "I'll need full access to the thermal management hardware. Physical, not just documentation." "You'll have it." She came on Friday with a man named Dr. Felix Okoro, who taught EV systems engineering at Michigan and who Priya recognized from a conference presentation she'd attended as a student. Okoro was quiet where Akar was direct. He stood close to the car and looked at things carefully and asked fewer questions but more specific ones, the kind that suggested he was building a model in his head and filling in the gaps. They were in the shop for 5 hours. Ethan and Priya answered everything. When there were things Ethan wasn't certain about, places where his approach was empirical rather than theoretically grounded, where he'd found what worked without fully understanding why, he said so. He didn't speculate. He showed them the bench test logs, all of them, including the failures, because the failure logs were part of the data and leaving them out would have been a form of dishonesty that he didn't intend to practice. Akar drove the car. Ethan had registered it for road use 2 weeks earlier. Navigating the paperwork for a rebuilt prototype had been its own adventure, requiring a conversation with a Michigan DMV official who'd never processed exactly this category of vehicle and who'd had to make 3 phone calls before deciding which box to check. But it had plates now, real ones, and a car took it out on Livernois and up to the Lodge freeway entrance ramp and drove it at highway speed for 20 minutes and brought it back. She got out of the car and looked at Ethan and said, "The thermal management system is what you say it is." "Yes." "You understand what that means?" "I have some sense of it." "The efficiency gain over current market architectures." She paused, choosing words carefully, which he noticed. "It's not incremental. You understand that?"
I know. Okoro had come to stand beside a car. He was holding the data tablet he'd been using to log the sensor readings from the car's onboard diagnostics. He looked at the numbers on it, and then at the car, and then at Ethan. How many people know about this? He asked. 3. 4. Now, 5 with you. You need to think carefully about your next steps, Okoro said. Not just practically, legally. You need a patent attorney before you talk to anyone else. We know that. Soon, he said. Not in a few weeks. This week. Ethan looked at Priya. She was already writing something in her notebook. The patent attorney was a woman named Carolyn Vess, who worked out of a firm in Midtown that handled IP for small tech businesses and independent inventors, and who came highly recommended by Okoro, who'd referred clients to her before. She was 58, precise, and appeared to run on black coffee and controlled impatience. She met with Ethan and Priya the following Monday and spent 3 hours going through the technical documentation and asking questions that were sometimes technical and sometimes legal, and sometimes a hybrid of both that required Ethan to think carefully before answering. At the end of the meeting, she said, "You have potentially patentable innovations in at least 3 areas. The phase change thermal management integration geometry is the primary one. That's novel. I'm reasonably confident of that based on what I've reviewed, and I'll need to do a full prior art search to confirm. The control software architecture is a secondary claim. The cell communication translation layer is a third, though that one may have overlapping prior art." "How long does the process take?" Priya asked. "Provisional filing I can have done within 2 weeks. That gives you 12 months of protection from the filing date while we develop the full application." She looked at Ethan. "Don't talk to any corporations or investors until I file. Anyone. Are we clear on that?" "Clear," Ethan said. She filed the provisional applications 11 days later. Ethan didn't sleep well during those 11 days, which was irrational. He knew it was irrational, knew that the likelihood of someone else independently developing the same architecture in the same window was negligible, but knowing that didn't help much. The night after Carolyn confirmed the filings, he went to the shop at 7 in the evening after Priya had gone home and stood next to the car for a while. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. The shop was quiet except for the grinding noise coffee machine cycling through its evening auto-clean cycle. And the car sat under the lights looking like what it was, a rebuilt prototype with imperfect panel work and 460 miles on a reconstructed odometer, containing something that didn't exist in any other car in the world. He thought about the auction, the rain, Victoria Sterling's brief controlled smile, the laughter that had drifted back across the parking lot. He wasn't angry about it exactly, or he was, but it was the kind of anger that had long since settled into something more functional. Fuel, maybe, in the least dramatic sense of that word. The laughter had been wrong, but it had been wrong for reasons that were understandable. They'd seen 5 broken cars that had already failed once. They'd seen what the cars were, not what they contained. He was a mechanic. He'd been taught to look at things for what they contained. He turned off the lights and went home. The story broke, in a controlled and deliberate way, 3 weeks later. Priya had gone back to her list and worked through it methodically. Not broadcasting, but targeted outreach to 4 journalists and 2 additional independent engineers, structured the same way as the initial contact with a car. Data first, identity second, physical access third. By the time any of them showed up at the shop, they'd been through enough of the verification process that the question wasn't whether the technology worked, but what it meant that it did. The first piece that ran was an EV Technology Review, a trade publication with a small but technically serious readership. The journalist, a man named Patrick Chen, who'd been covering electric vehicle development for 9 years, had spent 2 full days at the shop, driving the car, interviewing Ethan and Priya, reviewing the bench test documentation and the track data and Dr. Akar's written evaluation, which she'd agreed to provide. His piece was 4,000 words, careful in the way that trade journalism is careful, measured in its claims but unambiguous in its conclusion. An independent mechanic in Detroit had rebuilt 5 abandoned Sterling automotive prototypes into a single vehicle demonstrating thermal management performance that exceeded anything currently available in the production market. The article included the efficiency numbers. It ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Ethan's phone had received 47 calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He answered none of them. Priya answered 2, both journalists from larger publications, and took their information and said someone would call them back. And then she and Ethan sat in the shop and looked at each other with the specific expression of two people who have opened a door and are now watching what comes through it. "This is faster than I thought," Priya said. "Yeah. Is that good or bad?" "Depends on who's paying attention," he said. 12 miles away on Jefferson Avenue, someone was paying attention. He couldn't have known that yet, but he would find out soon. The second person to call, the one Priya had taken notes on and not called back, was a man named Ray Dunbar, who identified himself as representing a venture capital firm that focused on clean energy technology. Ray Dunbar called again on Saturday. On Sunday, he left a voicemail that was professional in tone and significantly higher in urgency than professional tone usually allows. On Monday morning, Ethan listened to the voicemail and thought about it, and then called Carolyn Vess. "Venture capital?" she said. "That's what he said." "Who else has called?" "I don't know yet. We've got dozens of missed calls." "Go through them with Priya. Make a list. Don't call anyone back until we've talked about who each one is and what they likely want." A pause. "Has Sterling Automotive called?" Ethan hadn't thought about that. He went through the missed calls that evening with Priya, and they identified numbers from trade publications, 3 universities, 2 VC firms, a representative from a Senate Energy Committee's office who'd apparently gotten the article forwarded by someone, and one number registered to a communications firm called Meridian Strategic that a quick search showed was frequently retained by large corporations for, the website's language was careful, brand and communication strategy in high-stakes environments. "That's a PR firm," Priya said. "I know what it is." "Sterling uses Meridian." She held up her phone, showing him a page from Meridian's client list that she'd found in about 90 seconds of searching. "They've been retaining them for at least 3 years. Ethan looked at the number on his missed calls list. "So Sterling knows." Sterling definitely knows. He thought about the auction parking lot, the man with the silver temples, the executive who'd made the competing bid and then backed off, who'd stood there watching Ethan load the cars with something unreadable in his face. He thought about Victoria Sterling's 15-second look at the EP7 units and the way she'd walked away. "Okay," he said. "What do we do?" "We call Carolyn," Priya said. "Obviously." Carolyn's advice was to do nothing reactive. Don't respond to the PR firm's contact. Don't respond to anything from Sterling, direct or indirect, without her present. Keep accepting verification requests from engineers and journalists. Those were building the evidentiary record and the public profile that made any aggressive corporate moves legally riskier. Think carefully about the VC conversations, which could be useful for resources but came with strings that needed examining. "Are you afraid of them?" Carolyn asked. She meant Sterling. "No," Ethan said. Then, "Should I be?" "You should be prepared. That's different from afraid." The thing about being prepared is that it's harder when you don't know the shape of what's coming. Ethan understood mechanical systems well enough to anticipate failure modes. You knew where a thermal system was likely to fail because you understood how heat moved through material, understood the physics of it. Corporate behavior had its own physics, but it wasn't the kind he'd spent years learning. What he did understand was the record he was building. Every engineer who drove the car and documented their findings, every article that ran with accurate technical details, every provisional patent filing that Carolyn had time-stamped and filed, that was the record. And the record was what mattered if this became a fight. Dr. Akar agreed to give a presentation at a University of Michigan symposium in December, 4 weeks out, using her evaluation of the EP7 rebuild as a case study in thermal management innovation. It wasn't a formal public demonstration of the car, but it was a credentialed academic presentation with the data behind it. And attendance at those symposiums included engineers from most of the major automotive companies in the region, which meant the technology would be in front of people who understood exactly what it was. Ethan spent 3 weeks before the symposium making sure the car was documentation ready. He went back through every system, every connection, every log from the bench testing and the road testing, and organized it into a technical package that was, as far as he could make it, complete and verifiable. If someone wanted to check his work, they could check every step of it. He asked Vitold, the machinist from Hamtramck, to review the fabrication documentation. Vitold came in on a Saturday, read through everything with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and made 3 small corrections to the tolerances Ethan had specified in the thermal module drawings. Not errors that had affected the build, but imprecisions in the documentation that Vitold, being Vitold, couldn't leave alone. "This is good work," Vitold said, setting the papers down. It was the second time he'd said that, and from Vitold it counted twice. "There are things I'd do differently now," Ethan said. "There are always things." Vitold picked up his coat. "The question is whether the things you did do were sufficient. In this case, they were." He paused at the door. "Who built the original program? The Sterling EP7 team?" "I don't know most of them. There was a chief engineer. I found his name in the build documentation. A man named Dennis Farr." "He good?" "I think he was very good. I think he was stopped before he finished." Vitold nodded slowly, the way of a man who has seen that kind of thing before. "That's a particular kind of bad luck," he said. "Being stopped before you finish." He left. Ethan stood there a moment, thinking about Dennis Farr, whose name appeared on the build documentation as the lead engineer for the EP7 program, whose handwriting, actual handwriting, in the margins of some of the printed spec sheets that had been included in the auction lot materials, Ethan had been reading for months, precise, small, with a habit of underlining key parameters twice when he was emphasizing something. Farr had known what he was building. The notes in the margins said so, not in any dramatic way, but in the way that someone's work notes carry their level of comprehension. Farr had understood the problem and had been tracking toward the solution. Ethan had solved the same problem. He'd taken a different path to get there. His phase change integration approach wasn't exactly what Farr had been moving toward, which Ethan could see in the design trajectory across the 5 units, but the destination was the same. He wondered where Dennis Farr was now. He wondered what it had felt like to have the program terminated. He didn't look him up. It felt like it would be the wrong thing to do at this particular moment, though he wasn't sure he could have explained why. The week before the Michigan Symposium, a man showed up at the shop unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. He drove a gray Audi, current model year, clean, and he was wearing a sport coat without a tie and carrying a leather portfolio, and he looked like the kind of person who had been coached on how to look less corporate than he was. He was about 50, fit in the maintained way of people whose fitness is partly professional, with gray at his temples, the same gray-templed man from the auction parking lot, the one who'd made the competing bid and backed off. Ethan recognized him from 20 feet away and felt something settle in his stomach that wasn't quite dread and wasn't quite satisfaction either. He was under the hood of a 2018 Chevy Volt that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Whitman, who had explained at considerable length that the car had been her husband's and that she needed it to keep running, and he straightened up and wiped his hands on his shop rag. "Ethan Cross?" the man said. "Yes." "I'm Damian Cole." He extended his hand. His handshake was the practiced kind. Firm, brief, the right duration for a first meeting. "Senior VP of Product Development at Sterling Automotive." "I know who you are," Ethan said. He didn't elaborate. He finished wiping his hands and hung the rag on the Volt's door mirror and waited. Cole seemed to have expected a different response to his name. He regrouped smoothly. That was the practiced part. "I was at the auction in November. You made a bid on lot 47. I did. And then you didn't." A pause. "We had some internal discussion about the strategic value of the units. After the auction. These things take time to—" "Mr. Cole," Ethan's voice was even. "What can I do for you?" Cole looked around the shop with a kind of measuring interest that he was trying to make look casual. His eyes settled on the EP7 unit, which was on hoist 2 with its hood up from the previous day's documentation work. He looked at it for a moment and then looked back at Ethan. "The car looks good," he said, "from what I can see. It runs better than it looks." "I've heard."
Another pause. The article in EV Tech Review it generated some discussion internally. I imagine it did. Cole opened the leather portfolio.
He had papers in it. Looked like a document, multi-page, with a law firm's header at the top that Ethan caught a glimpse of before Cole angled it slightly away. Sterling Automotive has a significant interest in the EP7 technology. As the original developer, as the entity that decommissioned and sold the technology at auction for $500, Ethan said. Yes. The decommissioning was an operational decision that the auction was a legal transfer of property. I have the documentation. Cole closed the portfolio. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was recalibrating, dropping some layer of the approach he'd planned and shifting to something more direct. That was interesting. It meant the first approach hadn't been working, and he'd noticed fast. We'd like to discuss an arrangement, he said. That's really what I'm here for, an arrangement that acknowledges your contribution while protecting the interests of both parties. What kind of arrangement? A purchase of the vehicle, the documentation, and any derivative IP you may have developed. He said it cleanly, without hesitation, in the way of someone who'd practiced the phrasing. We're prepared to be generous. How generous? Cole named a number. It was a real number, not insulting, not inflated, the kind of number that was designed to feel significant to a mechanic with a shop on Livernois Avenue and a borrowed $20,000 still on his books. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Mrs. Whitman's Volt, which still had its hood up and its ignition control module sitting on the fender on a clean cloth. Then he looked back at Cole. I'm not selling, he said. Cole had expected this too. You could see it in how quickly he moved past it. We understand this may not be about a simple purchase. We're open to, Mr. Cole. Ethan picked up the ignition control module and turned back to the Volt. I have provisional patents filed on the thermal management architecture, the control software, and the battery communication system. My attorney's name is Carolyn Vess. Anything you want to discuss with me goes through her. He set the module back in its housing. You can get her number from my website. A long silence. Cole was standing in the middle of a working garage on a Wednesday afternoon, in his sport coat without a tie, holding a leather portfolio with a law firm's letterhead, and the person he'd come to talk to was reinstalling an ignition control module in a 2018 Chevy Volt, and had just given him the name of an attorney. The symposium next week, Cole said. His voice had changed slightly. The Michigan thing. Sterling has people who will be attending. Most major automotive companies do, Ethan said. It's a well-regarded symposium. We're going to be paying close attention to what Dr. Akar presents. That's her decision about what to present. You'd need to speak to her about the content. Cole stood there another moment. He was deciding something, Ethan could tell, weighing whatever he'd come here prepared to do against whatever the reality of the conversation was telling him. Finally, he said, This is going to get complicated. It's already complicated. Ethan looked up from the Volt. It got complicated when your company sold 5 cars they hadn't finished building and then decided they wanted them back. Cole left. He walked back to the gray Audi without hurrying, got in, and drove away in the direction of Jefferson. Priya came out of the back room. She'd been in there the entire time, and Ethan had known she was in there, and he was fairly certain she'd heard most of it. How much did he offer? She asked. Ethan told her. She was quiet for a moment. That's real money. I know. You didn't even... I know. She sat down on the stool near the parts bench. Carolyn needs to know he was here. I'm calling her in 5 minutes. He said it's going to get complicated. He's right. Ethan straightened up and looked at Mrs. Whitman's Volt. The ignition module was seated correctly. He picked up his diagnostic scanner to confirm the connection. But complicated is different from over. Priya was quiet, looking at him. Then she said, Do you know what you're doing? It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without softening, because she'd learned early on that Ethan responded better to direct questions than to ones that were padded for comfort. He thought about it honestly. I know what I built, he said. I know it works. I know it's mine legally. I know that a company that had $70 million and 32 engineers in 4 years couldn't finish what I finished in 14 months in a garage. He set down the scanner. Past that? No. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I know what I'm not going to do. She accepted that. She went back to work. Carolyn Vess, when Ethan called her, said exactly 2 things about Cole's visit. The first was that Cole had come without an attorney present, which told her something about the approach Sterling was taking, testing the waters informally before committing to a formal position. The second was that they needed to accelerate the timeline on the full patent applications, and that she'd already been working on that, and that she'd need 3 specific things from Ethan's documentation by end of week. The third thing she said was, don't underestimate them. They have resources, and they have lawyers, and they have time. I'm not underestimating them, Ethan said. Good. Because underestimating them would be the only way you lose this. The Michigan Symposium was on a Thursday in early December. Dr. Akar's presentation was the third of the afternoon session, in a lecture hall with maybe 140 people in it. Engineers, researchers, a handful of journalists, several people whose affiliations weren't identifiable from where Ethan sat in the 4th row. He'd been invited as the subject of the case study, which meant he'd had to explain to the department secretary what his title was, and after some thought had written Independent Engineer Cross-Motion Research, which Carolyn had suggested and which was technically accurate. Priya sat beside him. She'd worn the blazer she reserved for occasions that required a blazer, which by Ethan's count was 3 occasions total in the 2 years she'd worked for him. Akar's presentation was precise and measured and made no claims that the data didn't directly support, which was exactly what it needed to be. She presented the thermal management architecture, explained the phase change integration approach, showed the efficiency numbers with the comparative data from current market architectures. She showed video from the track testing. She discussed the control software logic in sufficient technical depth that the engineers in the room were leaning slightly forward. Ethan watched the room while she talked. He watched the engineers in the 3rd and 5th rows in the back corners, the ones with company lanyards who were trying to look casual about the fact that they were taking notes. He watched a woman in the 6th row who'd written down one of the efficiency numbers twice, as if checking she'd gotten it right. He watched a man near the exit who'd stopped looking at his phone about 4 minutes into the presentation. He watched 2 men who'd come in together and sat in the far left section, both in their 40s, both with the particular neutral affect of people who are paid to gather information and not react to it. He didn't know who they were. He noted where they sat. During the Q&A, an engineer from the audience asked about the scalability of the thermal architecture to larger battery formats. Akar answered the engineering question, and then, because the question genuinely applied to Ethan's work more than hers, she looked at Ethan and raised an eyebrow. He stood up and answered the follow-up, briefly and specifically, and sat back down. The room's attention, when he stood, had a particular quality to it, not dramatic. Just the quality of attention that happens when people in a room understand that the person standing up is the person who made the thing they've been looking at for the past 40 minutes. After the session, 3 engineers introduced themselves to him in the hallway outside the lecture hall. All 3 were careful and professional and gave him business cards that he put in his jacket pocket. One of them, a woman from a battery development company, said, "The thermal distribution uniformity at high load, is that consistent across different ambient temperature ranges?" And they talked for 12 minutes, and it was the kind of conversation he hadn't had many of in his life. The kind where the other person is operating at full capacity and expects you to do the same. He drove back to Livernois with Priya. She'd been quiet most of the way, which with Priya meant she was processing something. "That went well," she said finally, when they were back on the lodge. "It went the way it should have. Those 2 men in the left section, I saw them. Sterling? Or someone representing them?" He changed lanes. "Doesn't matter. The data's public now. The presentation is recorded. There's nothing in that room that we're hiding." Priya nodded. She was quiet again for a while, and then she said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "The original engineer, the one whose notes are in the documentation." She'd seen the margins, too, at some point. "Dennis Farr." "What about him?" "Do you think he knows what happened, what you built?" Ethan thought about it. The EV Tech Review article had been specific about the origin of the vehicles, had mentioned the EP7 program by name, had described the abandoned project's architecture. If Dennis Farr was paying any attention to the electric vehicle technology press, and an engineer of his apparent caliber almost certainly was, he knew. Probably, Ethan said. How does that feel to him, do you think? Ethan drove for a moment. The lodge was mostly clear at this hour, the city lights coming on in the early December dark. I don't know, he said. I've thought about it. He had. He'd thought about it more than he'd said to anyone. What it would be like to be Dennis Farr, to have spent years on something and been stopped before the finish, and then to see someone else, a mechanic, not an engineer, working alone in a fraction of the space with a fraction of the resources, cross the line you'd been pulled back from. I hope it's not too bad, he said finally. I hope he knows the work he did was what made it possible. Priya didn't say anything. It was, Ethan said. He built most of this. He just didn't get to finish it. They pulled on to Livernois. The shop was dark. They'd left it locked for the day, which was unusual for a Thursday, but this had been an unusual Thursday. Ethan parked and sat for a moment. What are they going to do next? Priya asked. Sterling. Something legal, probably. Or something that looks like something legal. He thought about Carolyn's voice when she'd said they have resources. Or something that looks like a better offer than the one Cole made. He got out of the truck. Or both. Probably both. He unlocked the shop. The car was where they'd left it. On hoist 2, hood down, sitting in the overhead lights with the quiet that inanimate things have when no one's been with them for a while. He stood at the entrance for a moment looking at it. It was still imperfect, still carried the evidence of what it had been before he'd gotten to it. The panel gaps, the surface texture in places where the bodywork wasn't quite right, the slight asymmetry in the front fascia repair that a professional body shop would have fixed and that Ethan had decided was acceptable. All of that was still there. And under all of that, in every system that mattered, it worked the way nothing else in the world worked. Priya came and stood beside him. You're doing that thing where you just look at it, she said. Yeah. Is it useful? I don't know. He reached over and hit the light switch. The shop went dark. Sometimes looking at things is all you can do before the next thing starts. He locked up. They went their separate ways into the December night. Somewhere across the city, in offices that cost more per square foot than his entire building, people who wore sport coats without ties were making decisions about him and his car and what they were going to do about both. He drove home. He ate something. He couldn't remember what. He looked at the missed calls on his phone, 12 new ones since that morning, and put the phone face down on the counter. He sat at his kitchen table with his notebook and wrote down what he wanted to say to Carolyn tomorrow, and when his hand got tired, he stopped and sat there in the quiet. And outside the window, Detroit was doing what Detroit does in December, which is endure. The letter arrived on a Monday, 9 days after the Michigan Symposium, and it was the kind of letter that arrives in an envelope with a law firm's name embossed on it in a font that exists specifically to communicate seriousness. Carolyn Vess called Ethan at 8:15 that morning, before he'd gotten to the shop. Did you receive something from Hargrove Kellner, LLP? It's sitting on my workbench. Open it. Read it. Don't react to it. Call me back. He opened it. It was 4 pages, dense with legal language that he read twice slowly because speed would have let things slide past him, and he had learned from Carolyn that the things that slide past you in legal documents are usually the important ones. The summary, stripped of the language, was this. Sterling Automotive was asserting that the EP7 prototypes had been liquidated under a corporate surplus protocol that did not, per Sterling's legal interpretation, constitute a transfer of the associated intellectual property, that the IP had remained property of Sterling Automotive at the time of the auction, and that Ethan Cross's development activities using the vehicles constituted unauthorized use of proprietary technology. The letter requested, with a deadline of 15 business days, that Ethan cease all further development, demonstrations, and public disclosures related to the EP7 program, and that he engage in immediate discussion regarding the return of all materials, documentation, and derivative work. There was a second, shorter section.
It was framed as an alternative to the above, a good faith gesture, the letter called it, and it described a purchase arrangement that would resolve all outstanding matters, the terms of which would be provided upon Ethan's expression of interest. He called Carolyn back. IP doesn't transfer with surplus liquidation, she said, before he could summarize. That's their position. It's a reach. Surplus liquidation of physical assets containing proprietary systems is a gray area in IP law, but what saves you is the condition those vehicles were in and what you did to them. Meaning what? Meaning you didn't simply take their technology and use it. The thermal management architecture you developed is demonstrably different from what Sterling had built. You used the vehicles as a starting point, as an inspiration and a diagnostic resource. But the innovations you patented are yours. They're your solutions to a problem that Sterling failed to solve. The provisional filings establish priority, and the prior art search I've been running supports novelty. She paused. That said, I want you to come in today. This isn't something we handle by phone. He was at her office by 11. Priya came with him. They sat in Carolyn's conference room with the letter on the table between them and spent 3 hours going through it, and then another hour going through the strategy going forward, and by the end of that conversation, Ethan had a clearer picture of the terrain. Sterling's claim was aggressive and probably not strong enough to prevail in court, but it was strong enough to be expensive. Expensive in time, in legal fees, in distraction. That was likely the point. A well-resourced company filing a legal claim against an individual mechanic understood that even a weak claim created leverage. The alternative offer at the end of the letter was the leverage speaking. They're betting you can't sustain a legal fight, Carolyn said. Can I? She looked at him in the way of someone choosing their words with precision. If we fight this, it's going to cost. I won't pretend otherwise. The IP claim is the one we contest, and IP litigation is slow and expensive. The question is whether there are other ways to change the calculus. What other ways? Public demonstration, Priya said. Carolyn looked at her. Yes. If the technology is already in front of enough people, engineers, investors, journalists, industry figures, then Sterling's legal play looks like what it is. A big company trying to take back something it abandoned and couldn't build. The public record matters, Carolyn said. The more documented and witnessed the technology's origins and performance, the harder it is to characterize the IP dispute as having merit. It doesn't make the dispute go away, but it changes the environment it operates in. Ethan thought about the two men who'd sat in the left section of the lecture hall at the Michigan Symposium, taking notes with neutral expressions. He thought about Damian Cole standing in his shop in a sport coat without a tie, holding a leather portfolio with a law firm's letterhead. He thought about the way Cole had said, "This is going to get complicated," in a tone that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite a warning either. "I want to do a public demonstration," he said, "not at a conference. Here, at the shop. Invited engineers, investors, press, people who can verify what they're seeing in real time, not through a report or a presentation someone else gave." Carolyn was quiet for a moment. "That's a meaningful escalation." "They sent a cease and desist. I'd call that meaningful escalation." "It's their move," Priya said. "He's right. If we sit on the letter and negotiate quietly, we're doing this on their timeline." Carolyn picked up her pen and turned it over in her fingers, which Ethan had noticed was what she did when she was thinking seriously. If you do a demonstration, it needs to be airtight. Every person in that room needs to be someone whose evaluation carries weight. The car needs to perform exactly as documented. Any deviation from the established data, and they'll use it. The car performs exactly as documented. I've run 460 miles and 3 sets of controlled tests. I know, I've read the documentation. She set down the pen. All right, I'll draft the response to Hargrove Kellner. We'll contest the IP claim on the grounds I described. Simultaneously, you plan the demonstration. I want to know the date, the attendee list, and the test protocol before you send a single invitation. The response to Sterling's letter went out 6 days later. Ethan didn't read all of it. Carolyn had drafted it in the Register of Legal Correspondence, which was its own language. But she walked him through the key arguments, which were that the sale of the EP7 units at liquidation constituted a transfer of the physical assets in their entirety,
that the thermal management architecture Ethan had developed was a novel and independent innovation as evidenced by provisional patents filed prior to any contact from Sterling, and that cross-motion research would be proceeding with its development activities and public disclosures. The last paragraph noted that cross-motion research was prepared to discuss licensing arrangements if Sterling Automotive wished to pursue a commercial relationship on equitable terms. Carolyn had written that last paragraph on her own initiative. When she explained it to Ethan, she said, "It keeps the door open while making clear you're not folding. That matters for how this looks publicly if it becomes public, and it's going to become public." He planned the demonstration for the second week of January. The invitation list took 10 days to build and was, ultimately, 22 names: Dr. Akar and Dr. Okoro, 4 additional independent engineers whose credentials Carolyn had vetted, 3 journalists including Patrick Chen from EV Technology Review, 6 investors from the clean energy technology space whose names Priya had researched carefully, a representative from the Senate Energy Committee who'd called back in November, 2 automotive industry analysts, and 2 people Ethan added at the end who weren't on any strategic list. Marcus, because Marcus had loaned him $20,000 on the basis of knowing him, and Vitold, because Vitold had looked at the car and said, "This is good work," and those were words that mattered. Sterling was not invited, and Sterling would know about it anyway. The invitation went out with the test protocol attached, a specific, structured sequence of evaluations that each invited engineer would conduct independently, with instrumentation that Ethan provided and that they were welcome to supplement with their own. Range test, high-load performance evaluation, cold start thermal profile, charging cycle stress test. All of it documented in real time, with results logged immediately to a shared data repository that all attendees could access during the event. 12 of the 22 confirmed within 48 hours. 3 more confirmed by the end of the week. By the time January arrived, he had 17 confirmations, which was more than he'd expected and which meant the shop was going to be genuinely crowded. He spent the 10 days before the demonstration going over the car the way you go over something when you know that every person in the room is looking for the thing that's wrong. He didn't find anything wrong. He found 2 things he improved anyway: a connection in the charge controller circuit that had been perfectly functional, but that he reseated more securely because perfectly functional is different from as good as it can be, and a small firmware update to the thermal management control software that smoothed a minor irregularity in the secondary layer activation curve that he'd been meaning to address for 2 months. He told Priya about the firmware update. She said, "You're being you." What does that mean? It means you can't leave a thing alone if you think it could be better. That's called engineering. That's called anxious, she said, but she wasn't wrong about either. The night before the demonstration, he stayed late at the shop. Not working. Everything that could be done had been done. He was just there. Gerald from the tire shop next door knocked on the door at 8 and handed him a paper bag with 2 pieces of pie from the Coney Island cherry and lemon, and said he'd noticed Ethan's lights had been on every night that week and thought he might need calories. "Big day tomorrow," Gerald said. Something like that. "I don't understand what you're doing in here." Gerald looked at the car with the candid incomprehension of someone who had been watching this project from a distance for months and had never quite tracked it. "But whatever it is, it looks like it matters." "I think it does." "You think or you know?" Ethan ate a piece of pie. "No," he said. Gerald nodded like that was the right answer and went home. The demonstration began at 9 in the morning. People arrived in a spread between 8:45 and 9:15. Engineers first, then journalists, then investors, which tracked. Dr. Akar arrived exactly at 9 and immediately began reviewing the test protocol documentation she'd been sent. Marcus arrived in his work truck and stood near the back wall with his arms crossed, looking like a man who had loaned someone $20,000 and was now watching the return on that decision walk around in a room. Vitold arrived in his actual car, which was a 1987 BMW 5 Series he'd maintained for 37 years, and which was in extraordinary condition, and he parked it precisely, and came in and found a corner and watched everything with the quiet attention of someone who has been working at the boundary of what's possible for a long time. Patrick Chen from EV Tech Review was the only journalist Ethan recognized from prior interaction. The other 2 were from larger publications,
a technology writer from a national outlet and an energy correspondent from a financial press organization, and both of them had the kind of contained professional eagerness that journalists carry when they think they're in the right place. Priya ran the event.
That had been Ethan's decision, and it was the right one. She was organized in a way that he wasn't. She managed the logistics of getting 17 people through a structured test protocol in a 1,800 square foot shop with 2 hoists without the whole thing becoming chaotic. And she communicated with engineers and investors in the same direct, technically grounded register, which mattered because they were different audiences who needed slightly different things. Ethan answered questions. That's what he did for most of the day. Stood near the car or near the bench testing setup and answered questions. He answered them completely and without performance. When someone asked something he didn't know with certainty, he said he didn't know with certainty and showed them the data he had and let them draw conclusions. When Dr. Okoro asked about the long-term degradation profile of the phase change material under sustained thermal cycling, a question that Ethan's testing hadn't fully answered because it required more time, he said exactly that, and Okoro nodded like that was the correct answer. The testing took most of the day. By 3 in the afternoon, all 17 attendees had completed the protocol or some version of it, and the shared data repository had logs from 11 independent evaluation runs. The numbers held, every single time. At 4:15, one of the investors, a woman named Ingrid Sauer, who ran a clean energy fund out of Chicago, found Ethan near the back of the shop while most of the other attendees were still reviewing data or talking among themselves. She was direct in the way of people who have spent careers making decisions on incomplete information and have developed an allergy to wasted time. "What do you need?" she asked. "In what sense?" "To take this from one car in a garage to something that exists in the world." Ethan thought about it. "Capital for tooling and manufacturing development. Legal resources. I'm in an IP dispute with Sterling Automotive, research staff, a larger facility at some point." He looked at the shop. "Not yet on the last one, but eventually." "I know about the Sterling dispute. It's not a problem if your IP position is clean." "My attorney believes it is." "Your attorney is Carolyn Vess?" He was mildly surprised. "You know her?" "She's represented 3 companies in my portfolio." Ingrid looked at the car. "If she thinks your position is clean, it's probably clean." She pulled a card from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. "Call me this week, before you talk to the others." He looked at the card. He looked at the room. Marcus in the back, the engineers comparing data on laptops, Vitold talking to Dr. Akar, with the careful seriousness of 2 craftspeople recognizing each other, Priya managing 3 conversations at once near the entrance. "Okay," he said. The last attendee left at 6:30. Priya swept the shop. Ethan sat at the workbench and looked at the data repository summary on his laptop. 17 evaluation runs, results consistent with established documentation, 6 independent written statements from attending engineers that they'd agreed to provide, all of which would be incorporated into the public record. "That was a good day," Priya said from behind the broom. "Yeah." "Ingrid Sauer talked to you." "She did." "She runs one of the 3 biggest clean energy funds in the country." "I know." "What did she say?" "She said call her before I talk to the others." Priya stopped sweeping. "Ethan, I know." I know." He closed the laptop. "We need to let today settle before we do anything else." He was right about the settling. What he didn't anticipate was what happened before the settling had a chance to complete. 3 days after the demonstration, Patrick Chen's piece ran in EV Technology Review. It was twice as long as his first article, 8,000 words, detailed, with the data from the demonstration embedded and with quotes from Dr. Akar, Dr. Okoro, and 2 of the other attending engineers. It was the piece that crossed the line from trade publication story to something that the general automotive and technology press could no longer ignore. By the end of that week, the national technology outlet, whose correspondent had attended the demonstration, ran its own story, and the financial press piece followed 2 days later. The financial press piece was the one that changed things. It named Sterling Automotive explicitly, described the IP dispute in accurate terms, noted that the company had sent a cease and desist letter to a mechanic whose rebuilt prototype was now outperforming Sterling's own production vehicles, and included 2 paragraphs of no comment from a Sterling spokesperson who had clearly been advised to provide no comment but provided it in a way that satisfied no one. The story appeared on a Thursday. Sterling's stock opened down 4% Friday morning. Ethan found that out from Carolyn, who called him before he'd had his first coffee. "Have you seen the market?" "I don't watch the market." "Sterling's down 4 points on open." He sat with that for a moment. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt something closer to the unease you get when something you've set in motion gets bigger than the motion you intended. What does that mean for us? It means Sterling has a shareholder problem now on top of an IP problem, which means their calculus changes. Carolyn's voice was precise as always, but with something behind it. Not satisfaction exactly, but the quality of someone watching a case develop in the direction they'd argued it would. "I expect contact from their legal team within 48 hours. The contact came in 36. It wasn't from Hargrove Kellner, it was from a different firm, which Carolyn noted with a dry observation that meant the change of counsel suggested something about how Sterling was reconsidering its approach. The contact requested a meeting, attorney to attorney, to discuss a mutually beneficial framework for resolution. Carolyn took the meeting. Ethan didn't attend. She debriefed him afterward in her conference room with the kind of careful summary that strips out everything except what matters. They want to acquire the technology. The offer has moved significantly from what Cole proposed at your shop. We're talking about a number with 9 figures. Ethan was quiet. "That's real money," Carolyn said, in exactly the same tone Priya had used when Cole had been at the shop. "I want you to understand what we're talking about. What are the terms?" "Full purchase. You transfer the IP, the documentation, the vehicle, all derivative work. Non-disclosure. Non-compete in electric vehicle thermal management for 7 years. She paused. "Cole's name isn't in the term sheet, but the structure is. The acquisition would effectively bury the question of whether the original program's termination was appropriate." There it was. Ethan had been working toward that for a while. Not consciously, but the way you work toward something when enough pieces keep pointing the same direction. The EP7 program had been terminated. The official reason was strategic realignment, but the original program hadn't failed technically. It had been closed administratively, by someone with the authority to close it, before the engineering team had the chance to prove out what the engineering team had apparently been close to proving. Damian Cole was Sterling's senior VP of product development. He had been in that role for 6 years. The EP7 program had been terminated 5.5 years ago. "Cole killed the program," Ethan said. Carolyn looked at him with an expression that was neither confirmation nor denial. "I don't have evidence of that." "Neither do I. Yet." "Ethan, I'm not going to do anything with it yet," he said. "But I want to understand what we're dealing with." He looked at the term sheet summary she'd given him. Non-compete in electric vehicle thermal management for 7 years. 7 years was the duration you specified if you were trying to ensure that a particular line of inquiry didn't get pursued in the environment you didn't control. "What happens if I refuse the acquisition?" "They continue the IP litigation, possibly escalate it. They have significantly more resources for a sustained legal fight than you do." "And if I accept?" "You're compensated significantly. The technology disappears into Sterling and doesn't emerge as anything that competes with their existing product lines, probably." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm laying out the landscape." "I know." He folded the summary sheet. "Tell them I need 2 weeks." The 2 weeks were not restful. Ingrid Sauer came to Detroit. That happened 4 days after the meeting between attorneys, after Ethan had called her as she'd asked and spent 90 minutes explaining the full picture. The technology, the IP dispute, Sterling's acquisition offer, the term sheet's non-compete structure. She flew in on a Wednesday and they met at the shop, just the 2 of them, and she looked at the car and asked 3 questions and then said, "If you refuse the acquisition and we structure an investment, you're in a long legal fight with a company that has $8 billion in revenue." "I know. The IP case is winnable, but it's expensive and slow." "I know." Why refuse? It was the right question. He'd been asking it himself for days, in the early mornings and the late evenings when the shop was quiet, and the decision had the space to be a real thing rather than a managed thing. Why refuse a 9-figure offer for a car he'd built in a borrowed garage with borrowed money? Financially, the answer was obvious, and the answer was take it. Practically, strategically, in any measurable frame, take it. Because of what's in the non-compete, he said. If I take this, the technology is gone. Not gone public, not gone into use in a way that changes something, gone into a drawer while Sterling figures out how to make it not compete with what they're already selling. You don't know that. I know that Damian Cole killed the original program. I don't have documentation yet, but I'm close to certain. If he killed it then, he'll manage this acquisition to protect the same interest. He looked at the car. 32 engineers spent 4 years building towards something, and Cole buried it before they could finish. The technology I built uses their foundation. If I sell this and it disappears, that's the same thing happening twice. Ingrid was quiet for a long moment. She was a serious person, and she was taking this seriously, which meant she wasn't going to let him get away with an emotional argument if it didn't hold up structurally. That's not a legal argument, she said. No. It's not a financial argument. No. It's not even an entirely rational argument. I know what it is, Ethan said. She looked at him. Then she looked at the car. Then she said, all right, here's what I can do. What she could do was structure an investment that gave cross-motion research capital for legal defense and initial development work without requiring a full acquisition. A minority stake with defined terms, investor board representation, milestone-based additional funding. She laid it out in the kind of precise language that meant she'd already thought through most of the structure before arriving. It wasn't a gift. There were conditions and expectations, and she was clear about both. But it was real money, and it was structured to keep the technology in Ethan's control. If we do this, she said, you need to know the fight gets harder before it gets easier. I know. Sterling will escalate. They have board pressure now. They have shareholders watching. They have a story in the financial press that names them as the company that abandoned a breakthrough technology and is now trying to buy it back through legal intimidation. That makes them desperate, and desperate companies do things that well-managed companies don't. He thought about the 2 men in the lecture hall at the Michigan Symposium. The Meridian Strategic PR firm number on his missed calls list. Cole in his shop with the leather portfolio. What kind of things, he asked. Access attempts. Not necessarily illegal, but information gathering. Looking for anything in your documentation, your background, your financial history that they can use to muddy the IP claim or your credibility. She paused. Is there anything like that? He thought about it honestly. I borrowed $20,000 from a friend to build the car. Documented? Informally. Marcus and I shook hands. Get it documented. This week. Carolyn can draft a promissory note backdated to the original conversation with Marcus's agreement. Anything else? The shop's finances. Is everything clean? Clean enough. We're small. There are years where the tax return looks like we barely survived, because some years we barely survived. That's not a problem. That's a mechanic shop. She stood up. I'm going to send you a term sheet by Friday. Have Carolyn review it. Don't sign anything this week. She left. Ethan sat at the workbench and called Priya and told her what had happened. She's investing, Priya said. Term sheet Friday. Ethan, a pause. Do you know what this means? It means the fight gets harder before it gets easier. That's what she said. That's not what I meant. He knew what she meant. He just wasn't ready to name it yet. The documentation on Dennis Farr came from a source he hadn't expected. 4 days after Ingrid Sauer's visit, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize and a voice that identified itself as belonging to a woman named Rachel Farr, who said she was calling because her husband had read the EV technology review articles and had been up at 2 a.m. for 3 nights and had finally told her to call Ethan Cross and say that Dennis Farr would like to speak with him if Ethan was willing. Ethan was willing. Dennis Farr was 53. He'd left Sterling Automotive following the EP7 program's termination and had spent 4 years at a battery technology startup that had been acquired and absorbed and was currently doing independent consulting work. He lived in Ann Arbor. His voice on the phone was the voice of someone who had been sitting with something for a long time and wasn't sure how to put it down. They talked for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon. Priya was at the shop and Ethan put it on speaker, not because he wanted an audience, but because Priya's presence in the room helped him stay grounded. Farr had read the articles. He'd looked at the performance numbers. He'd recognized his own work in the description of the architecture. Not Ethan's innovations, which he was precise about acknowledging, but the underlying structure, the cell configuration, the drive unit integration logic, the things that Ethan had built on. "I want to tell you something," Farr said, about 40 minutes in. His voice had settled from the slightly formal opening into something more direct. "About how the program ended." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." A pause. "The program was terminated in March. Our team had a presentation scheduled for the following month, an internal review that, based on where we were in the development cycle, I was confident was going to result in extended funding. We were close. I knew we were close. Not done, but close enough that any serious technical review would have extended the program." "What happened to the presentation?" "It was canceled. Cole told us the board had made a strategic decision to pivot before the review happened, that the presentation was no longer relevant." Another pause, longer. 3 weeks before our scheduled review, Cole had met privately with the board's finance committee and presented a cost-benefit analysis of the program that, I found this out much later, from someone who'd been in the room, characterized the thermal management problem as unresolvable without a fundamental redesign that would require an additional 2 to 3 years. That wasn't true. It wasn't anywhere close to true. We were 3 to 4 months from a working solution. Ethan was quiet. "He killed it," Farr said, "before anyone who understood the technical state of the work could evaluate it. I don't know exactly why. The best explanation I've been able to construct is that Cole had already committed to the Korean battery licensing deal, committed in ways that were personal as well as corporate, if you understand what I mean. And a successful EP7 program would have made that deal unnecessary and would have raised questions about why it had been pursued. He had a financial interest in the licensing deal? I can't prove that. I looked for documentation and couldn't find it." Farr's voice was careful. "What I can tell you is that the licensing deal was announced 6 weeks after the EP7 program was terminated, and that the terms were structured in a way that included compensation provisions for executives who'd been instrumental in establishing the partnership." A pause. Cole was listed among them. Priya had stopped moving on the other side of the shop. Ethan looked at the wall for a moment. "Would you be willing to say this on record?" he asked. "To my attorney. Not publicly yet. To my attorney." A long silence. Long enough that Ethan wondered if he'd overstepped. "That's why I called," Farr said finally. "My wife told me to stop making it someone else's decision whether this comes out. She said, and she's right, she's usually right, that I've been waiting for someone else to ask the right question for 5 years, and it occurred to her, reading that article, that you might be the someone." Ethan felt something shift in the room. Not dramatic, just a quiet, irreversible settling, the kind that happens when a thing you've been building toward becomes a thing you're now standing inside. "I'll have my attorney call you this week," he said. "All right. Mr. Farr? Dennis? The work you did, on the program." Ethan chose the words carefully because he meant them, and he didn't want to be careless with something he meant. The unit architectures, the build sequence, the decisions you made about the thermal iterations. I could see the thinking in the documentation. It was right. You were right about the direction. Another silence. This one had a different quality. "I know," Farr said. "That's the part that was hardest to live with. Not failing. Knowing you weren't failing and being stopped anyway." They ended the call. Priya came and sat at the workbench. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Cole?" she said finally. "Yes. That's why the non-compete was 7 years. That's why the acquisition buries the question. Yes." She turned this over. "Carolyn needs to hear all of this. She will, tomorrow morning. What does this change?" Ethan thought about it. It changed the story of why the EP7 program had failed, which he'd suspected but not documented. It changed what a public demonstration of his car might expose beyond the technology itself. It changed the weight of what Sterling was trying to buy and what they were trying to bury when they sent Cole to his shop in a sport coat with a leather portfolio. It changed specifically why walking away from the acquisition mattered in ways that went beyond his own interests.
It changes what this is, he said. Which is what? It was already about the technology. Now it's also about what was done to the people who built it. He looked at the car. That doesn't change what I need to do. It just changes why it matters. Carolyn took Dennis Farr's statement the following Wednesday. She spent 4 hours with him, recorded, documented, specific. Farr brought personal notes he'd kept from the program's final months. Not proprietary Sterling documents, but his own contemporaneous observations. The kind of record a careful engineer makes for himself when he's watching something go wrong and wants to understand it later. They were dated. They were specific. They named Cole directly in several entries. Carolyn called Ethan that evening. This changes the posture of the IP dispute significantly, she said. Cole's financial interest in the licensing deal creates a question about whether the EP7 termination was a legitimate corporate decision or a self-interested one. That's a fiduciary issue that Sterling's board will have to take seriously when it becomes visible. When does it become visible? That depends on what you want to do with it. But I'll tell you this. When Ingrid Sauer's term sheet closes and you have the resources to sustain the legal fight, the question of when and how Farr's account enters the public record becomes a significant strategic asset. A pause. And Ethan, when Sterling finds out Farr has talked to you, and they will find out, the nature of their response is going to tell us something important about how exposed Cole actually is. She was right about that. Sterling found out within 10 days. Ethan didn't know how, but he had his suspicions. Farr had mentioned, offhandedly, that a former colleague still inside Sterling had reached out after the EV Tech Review articles, and information moved through those networks in ways that were hard to control. Whatever the channel, the response came in the form of a phone call to Carolyn from Hargrove Kellner that departed entirely from the measured legal language register of the previous correspondence, and that Carolyn described to Ethan as heated. They want Farr's statement suppressed, she said. They're framing it as confidential proprietary information from a former employee, which it isn't, since it's his own contemporaneous notes. They threatened additional claims. Additional to the IP claim? Tortious interference. Defamation. Neither of which has merit, which means their volume rather than substance. She paused. Cole is scared. What does that tell you? It tells me the Farr account is accurate, and Cole knows it's accurate and knows what it means if it enters the litigation. Her voice was steady, but with something in it that he'd come to recognize as Carolyn Vess at her most focused. It also tells me we should schedule the demonstration you've been discussing. He'd been discussing it with Priya and with Ingrid, who had signed the term sheet 2 days earlier and whose capital had cleared escrow that same morning. A full public demonstration. Not the controlled invited event in January, but an open one, with independent engineers and investors and press, structured specifically as a public verification of the technology's performance claims. Documented, witnessed, real-time, with Farr's account already in Carolyn's files and the provisional patents already filed, and the data from 17 independent evaluations already in the public record. Next month, Ethan said, first week of February. I'll need the protocol 2 weeks before. You'll have it. He sat in the shop after the call late on a Thursday evening, with the kind of quiet that accumulates in a space where significant work has been done and the next significant work is coming. The car was on hoist 1. The lights were on. Outside, it was January in Detroit, which is winter doing its most serious work. He thought about the auction, the rain, the 5 broken cars and the $500, and Victoria Sterling's controlled smile and the laughter that had drifted back across the wet asphalt parking lot. He thought about Dennis Farr up at 2 a.m. for 3 nights, his wife finally telling him to make the call. He thought about the margins of the build documents, the precise small handwriting, the double underlines, the thinking of a man who knew what he was building and had been stopped before he could finish it. He was going to finish it, not because of the anger, though the anger was still there in its settled, functional form, not because of the money, though the money mattered and he wasn't going to pretend it didn't, because the work was real and the work was right, and the work deserved to exist in the world rather than in a corporate acquisition file in a law firm's basement. He turned off the lights. He locked up. He walked to his truck through the cold. February was coming. The public demonstration happened on a Tuesday in early February.
in the parking lot behind Cross Motion Garage, and the two adjacent lots that Gerald had agreed to let them use after Ethan explained the situation over coffee one morning, and Gerald had said, with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who doesn't make things complicated, that he didn't need the space on Tuesday and Ethan should take it. They'd set up a quarter-mile test corridor using traffic cones and temporary barriers that Marcus had sourced from his equipment rental inventory. Priya had coordinated the instrumentation, data logging equipment mounted to the car's OBD port, and 4 external sensor arrays positioned along the corridor that would capture thermal profiles, power draw, and velocity data in real time, all of it feeding to a shared display that the assembled crowd could watch as it happened. The display was a large monitor mounted on a folding stand near the entrance to the garage, visible from most of the lot, and it was running before the first person arrived. 31 people came. That was 11 more than the January demonstration, and the composition was different. Fewer engineers from the verification circuit, more press, more investors, and 3 figures Ethan hadn't expected. A representative from the Michigan Department of Transportation who'd been sent by someone's office for reasons that weren't entirely clear, an analyst from a major automotive consulting firm whose attendance suggested that firm's clients had been asking questions, and a man who introduced himself only as being from a family office that invested in advanced manufacturing and who had the affect of someone accustomed to being in rooms where significant decisions were made and not announcing his presence. The attorneys were also there, or adjacent to there. Carolyn had brought a colleague, and there were 2 men near the back of the gathering who were clearly not press and not engineers, and who Ethan recognized, from the particular quality of their attention, as Sterling's people. He didn't know if they were Hargrove Kellner attorneys or internal counsel or something else. It didn't matter. They were welcome to watch. Ethan had considered having someone else run the demonstration, Priya or one of the attending engineers, but Carolyn had argued against it. The car was his work and his knowledge. Any question that came up in real time would be answered fastest and most credibly by him, and credibility in real time was the point of doing this publicly rather than submitting documentation. So he drove. He ran the protocol in the sequence they'd published in advance: acceleration and high-load performance first, then the sustained highway speed range simulation, then the cold start thermal profile using a car that had been sitting in the unheated lot since 5 that morning in 22-degree air. The cold start test was the one that produced the clearest reaction from the crowd. The thermal management system initializing in low ambient conditions was a known weakness of conventional battery architectures, and the display showed the cross-motion system handling it with a speed and smoothness that drew actual quiet from the assembled group. Not applause, just the particular silence of people who expected to see a problem and didn't. He ran the protocol twice, both times identical within the margins of normal variation. Both times logged and visible in real time on the display that 31 people were watching. Patrick Chen asked one question during the second run, standing near the display with his recorder out. Is there anything in today's test that differs from the controlled testing you've previously documented? No, Ethan said. He was still in the car. He rolled down the window to answer. This is the same car running the same systems. The data will confirm that. Chen wrote something. One of Sterling's 2 observers also wrote something, which Ethan noticed. The formal portion ended at 1:30. The informal portion, which was really a series of separate conversations happening simultaneously in different corners of the lot and inside the shop, ran until nearly 4. Ethan moved between them, answering questions, showing the thermal module documentation to an engineer from the consulting firm who wanted to understand the phase change integration geometry, walking 2 of the investors through the patent filing status, with Carolyn present to handle the legal specifics. Dennis Farr had come. Ethan hadn't known he was going to come. Farr had mentioned in a text that morning that he was thinking about it and wasn't sure. But he was there, standing near the back of the crowd during the demonstration, a compact man in a gray jacket with the look of someone watching something they have complicated feelings about. After the formal portion ended, Ethan found him near the entrance to the shop, looking at the car. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked. He meant the question to be general, but it came out more specific than that. Farr looked at the car for a moment before answering. "Complicated," he said. "You did what we were trying to do.
Different path, but the destination's the same. He was quiet for a second. That should bother me more than it does.
I think it doesn't bother me because of what you built it from. He looked at Ethan. You used our work. That matters to me. That it didn't just get thrown away. It's in every system, Ethan said. Without the sequence your team built, I don't have a starting point. I have 5 random broken cars. Farr nodded slowly. He seemed to want to say something else, and to be deciding whether to. Cole is going to try to discredit me, he said finally. Whatever I told your attorney, he's going to find something to use, or he's going to fabricate something. Carolyn knows that. We've thought about it. I have everything I gave her backed up, multiple locations. My wife knows where it is. Good. My lawyer knows about it too. I finally got a lawyer 2 weeks ago. He said it with the dry self-awareness of someone who'd been avoiding a necessary thing. She said I should have done it 5 years ago. Better now than later. That's what she said too. He looked back at the car. What happens to it? The car. After. I don't know yet, Ethan said honestly. Depends on what the next few months look like. Farr left around 2:30. Marcus found Ethan shortly after and handed him a coffee from the Coney Island on the corner, because Marcus had figured out early in the morning that there was no coffee set up for the event and had gone and gotten some, which was exactly the kind of thing Marcus did. How do you feel? Marcus asked. Tired. Before tired. Ethan thought about it. Like something just became real that was theoretical before. Marcus drank his coffee and looked at the lot. The cones still set up, the sensor arrays being collected by Priya and the technician she'd hired for the day. The last few attendees talking in clusters. You know I don't understand most of what happened out there today. I know. But I understand that all those people came here and watched the car do what you said it would do, and nobody left saying you were wrong. No. That's enough for me. He finished his coffee. The $20,000, by the way. No rush. I'm paying you back this month. Marcus looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Ethan looked at the signed term sheet that had cleared 2 weeks ago, which meant for the first time in 14 months, he was not running on the edge of a borrowed margin. It's important to me. Marcus accepted that without argument because he understood important to me. The demonstration's impact moved faster than the January event had, partly because the press contingent was larger, and partly because this time the story had more layers to it. Not just the technology, but the IP dispute. And through the IP dispute, the larger story of what Sterling Automotive had abandoned and why and who had benefited from the abandonment. Patrick Chen's follow-up piece ran Thursday morning and was the most read article EV Technology Review had published in 4 years, according to the note Chen sent Ethan with a link. The financial press had 2 pieces by Friday. One of the general technology outlets ran a story Saturday with the headline that Ethan read once and didn't read again, not because it was inaccurate, but because seeing his own situation reflected in headline language felt strange, in a way he didn't want to spend time on. Sterling's stock, which had partially recovered after its initial drop following the first round of press coverage, fell again, this time by 6% over 3 days. The board meeting happened, as far as Ethan could reconstruct from what Carolyn eventually learned through channels that were not entirely direct, on a Thursday 2 weeks after the public demonstration. He didn't know what was said in that meeting. He knew that Damian Cole was placed on administrative leave the following Monday, which was announced in a tersely worded internal communication that somehow found its way to Patrick Chen within 24 hours. He knew, because Carolyn was notified by Hargrove Kellner, that Sterling was withdrawing the IP litigation. Not settling. Withdrawing. Carolyn called him when the withdrawal notification came in. Her voice was controlled, but there was something in it he hadn't heard before in their interactions. Something close to genuine surprise, which from Carolyn meant it was a significant development. They've withdrawn the claim. All of it. With a release of liability in your favor. He was at the workbench. He set down what he was holding. Why? Because pursuing the claim would require discovery, and discovery in an IP dispute involving the EP7 program would expose everything Farr documented. Cole's termination of the program, the licensing arrangement, the compensation provisions. She paused. Someone on Sterling's board made a decision that the cost of the litigation, not the financial cost, the exposure cost, was higher than whatever the technology was worth to them. Or someone on Sterling's board made a decision that Coal's position was indefensible. Those may be the same decision. He sat with that for a moment. The litigation was gone. Coal was on administrative leave. The public record was what it was. 17 independent evaluation reports, 2 rounds of press coverage, Dennis Farr's documented account, provisional patents filed and pending. All of that existed now, regardless of what Sterling did next. What happens to Coal? Ethan asked. That's an internal Sterling matter. If the board pursues a formal investigation into the EP7 termination and the licensing compensation, there are potential legal consequences. If they don't, she paused. Administrative leave can be a destination or a transition. I don't know which this is. Will the board pursue it? Depends on how much pressure the shareholders apply, and that depends on how much the story keeps developing publicly. Another pause. Ethan, you've won the immediate fight. I want you to know that clearly. The IP claim is gone. Your patents are proceeding. You have Ingrid Sauer's investment, and you have a technology that the industry has now independently verified. What happens with Coal and with Sterling's internal accountability, that's a different matter, and it's not entirely in your hands. I know, he said. How do you feel about that? It was not the kind of question Carolyn Vess typically asked. He noticed that. I feel like winning the immediate fight is not the same as being done, he said. She was quiet for a moment. No, it's not. He sat with the withdrawn litigation for a day before telling Priya. Not because he was withholding it, but because he needed to understand what it meant before he explained it to someone else. Priya, when he told her, went through a sequence of reactions that she didn't usually let show. Relief first, then something that might have been delayed acknowledgement of how long the tension had been running, and then the particular forward-looking focus she defaulted to when something resolved and the next thing needed attention. Ingrid needs to know, she said. She already does. Carolyn called her. What does Ingrid think the next step is? She thinks we need to make a decision about the business structure, whether cross-motion research stays small and licenses the technology, or whether we try to build towards something bigger. What do you want? He had been asking himself that question in the early mornings for 2 weeks. The answer kept changing depending on what time of day he asked it and what he'd been thinking about before. I want the technology in use, he said. Actually in use. Not in a licensing arrangement where it sits in a drawer. So bigger. Something bigger. Priya nodded. She didn't look surprised. We're going to need people. Real people, not just us. I know. And a bigger space. I know. And she stopped. You're going to miss this. He looked at the shop, the 2 hoists. Mrs. Whitman's Volt, which he'd been putting off returning because she didn't drive it much in winter and he'd been distracted. The coffee machine with the grinding noise. The pegboard tools. I'm not leaving, he said. Whatever gets bigger, this stays. This is where it started. She accepted that. She went back to what she'd been working on. The offer came on a Friday afternoon in late February. Not from Coal. Coal was on administrative leave, which meant he was out of the channel. It came from Victoria Sterling directly, or more accurately from Victoria Sterling's personal assistant, who called Ethan's phone at 2:15 and asked if Mr. Cross would be available for a meeting with Miss Sterling at a time of his choosing, and if so, whether he had a location preference. He thought about that for a moment. My shop, he said. Monday at 10. Victoria Sterling arrived at 10:02 on Monday morning alone. No assistant, no umbrella woman, no attorney, no man with a silver-templed hair and a leather portfolio. She drove herself in a car that was not an SUV. It was a Sterling automotive sedan from 3 years ago, the company's current flagship, and she parked it in the lot outside the shop and got out and walked in without waiting for anyone to open anything. She looked different than she had at the auction. Not older. It wasn't that. She looked like someone who had been in a difficult place for several weeks and hadn't slept well, and was choosing, with considerable effort, to come here anyway. The controlled, managed quality that had characterized her at the auction was still there, because it was clearly structural to who she was, but it sat differently. Like armor that fit the same, but was heavier than it used to be. Ethan was at the workbench, Priya was in the back room. He'd told Priya she could stay or leave, and she'd said she'd stay, but give them space, which was what she did. Victoria looked around the shop. She looked at the car on hoist 2. She looked at the bench testing setup along the north wall, which was still assembled from the ongoing development work. She looked at the tools on the pegboard and the laminated hoist maintenance schedule and the 4-year-old laptop. She took all of it in without comment. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said. "Sit down if you want," Ethan said. He gestured to the stool near the parts bench. She sat. It was not the kind of sitting she usually did. He could see the adjustment in it, the slight recalibration of a person who doesn't usually sit on shop stools. "I owe you an apology," she said. He waited. "At the auction." "What I said, the way I said it." She paused. "I dismissed you. I dismissed the work you'd done before you'd done it, and I did it in a way that was not necessary. I was wrong about the cars, and I was wrong about you." He looked at her. She was meeting his eyes, which he noted. Some people apologize to a spot somewhere between your face and the wall behind you. She was looking directly at him, and the discomfort of it was visible, but she wasn't looking away from it. "I accept that," he said. He meant it. He wasn't in the business of carrying grievances that had been acknowledged, and the apology was real. He could tell the difference. "Why did you come yourself?" "Because it needed to be me." She said it simply. Not an attorney. Not Damian Cole, who should never have been the person handling this in the first place. A brief pause at Cole's name. Not guilt exactly, but the weight of someone reckoning with a mistake that had been expensive. "Me." "Okay." She opened the bag she'd brought, a leather document case, not a portfolio, and set a bound document on the workbench between them. It was thick. "We'd like to propose an arrangement," she said. "I want to walk you through it personally before you have your attorney review it. I want you to hear the intent from me before you read the terms." "Tell me." Sterling Automotive is proposing a licensing partnership, not an acquisition. She said the distinction clearly, like someone who understood why it mattered. Cross-Motion Research retains ownership of the thermal management IP. Full ownership. The patents are yours. We license the technology for use in Sterling's production vehicles, under terms that include royalty payments per unit, a revenue share from any commercial applications, and joint development rights for next-generation improvements. Joint meaning your team and ours, with Cross-Motion's lead position on the core thermal architecture respected. He was listening carefully. He had promised himself when the meeting was arranged that he would listen to all of it before responding to any of it. "There's more," she said. "Sterling is committed to maintaining all current manufacturing jobs through the transition to the new architecture. That's in the document as a binding term, not a statement of intent." She paused. "And we're proposing a funded engineering scholarship program. 25 scholarships annually, targeted specifically at candidates from working-class backgrounds, affiliated with Cross-Motion Research's hiring pipeline." She looked at him steadily. "That was not my attorney's idea. That was mine." He looked at the document on the workbench. It was real paper with real weight. He didn't pick it up yet. "Why the scholarship program?" he asked. "Because you built this in a garage on Livernois Avenue." She said it without sentiment. "And the industry loses people who could build things like this because the industry doesn't look for them where they are. I've known that for a long time. I didn't do anything about it." She paused. "I'd like to do something about it." He picked up the document. He turned to the first page. The terms were there: licensing structure, royalty rates, joint development framework, workers' protections, the scholarship program, a governance structure that kept Cross-Motion Research independent from Sterling's operational control. He read the first 3 pages while she sat quietly. "This is not what Cole offered," he said. "No. The non-compete is gone. Yes. The acquisition structure is gone. Yes, entirely." She waited while he read another page. "Mr. Cross, I'm not going to pretend the motivation here is purely principled. Sterling needs this technology. We needed it 5 years ago, and we don't have it because of decisions that were made badly by someone I trusted with significant authority. That's on me too. Not the decisions he made, but the fact that I gave him the authority to make them without adequate oversight. She paused. I'm not here asking you to forgive the company for what happened. I'm asking you to consider whether there's an arrangement that serves both of us and the people who work at Sterling and the people who might work at Cross Motion. He set the document down. What happened to Cole? Her expression shifted slightly, the professional composure adjusting around something that was clearly not comfortable. Damian Cole has been formally separated from Sterling Automotive, effective this week. The circumstances of the EP7 program's termination are under internal review. There are potential legal matters related to his compensation from the licensing arrangement that are being assessed separately. She was careful with every word. I can't tell you more than that. Is he going to face real consequences? That depends on what the review finds and what the legal assessment determines. She met his eyes. I'm not protecting him. If you're asking me that directly, I'm not protecting him. What he did to the EP7 program, what he did to the people who worked on it, what he tried to do to you through the litigation, none of that is acceptable, and I'm not going to manage the consequences to minimize his exposure. A pause. That's as honest as I can be. He thought that was probably as honest as she could be. He also thought it was more honest than he'd expected, which told him something about what the last few weeks had done to her internal accounting. I need my attorney to review this, he said. Of course. And I want Dennis Farr involved in any joint development framework. He designed the original architecture this is built on. His team's work is in every system in that car. If we're doing joint development, his name and his contribution need to be formally recognized. She was quiet for a moment. Whatever she felt about Dennis Farr and what his documented account had done to Damian Cole, and by extension to Sterling's stock price and board dynamic, she was quiet about it. That's a reasonable request, she said. I'll have counsel include language. Not language. An actual role. Consulting position. Minimum. Paid. All right. He looked at the document again. He looked at the car on the hoist. He thought about the 5 cars in the rain, and the $500, and the 14 months, and Marcus's $20,000, and Dennis Farr up at 2 a.m. for 3 nights, and 32 engineers who'd spent 4 years building something that had been buried before they could finish it. He thought about Priya saying, we're going to need people. Real people. There's something else I want, he said. Victoria waited. The scholarship program. I want it structured so that the recipients come through Cross Motion's evaluation process, not Sterling's HR pipeline. Sterling funds it, but we select. Working class candidates, candidates from communities like this one. He gestured toward the window, toward Livernois, toward Detroit doing what Detroit does. Who have the aptitude and the interest, and who aren't being found by the industry because the industry isn't looking in the right places. Agreed, she said. No hesitation. He looked at her. That was fast. It was a good idea the first time I heard it. It's still a good idea. Something in her voice that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. I should have built something like it 10 years ago. I didn't. He stood up. She stood up. He picked up the document. I'll have my attorney review this by end of week. I'll come back to you with any changes. Fair. She extended her hand. He shook it. She started toward the door and then stopped. She turned back, and something in her expression had shifted from the managed professionalism into something less managed. The car, she said. Can I see it? Just look at it properly. He nodded. She walked to hoist 2 and stood in front of the EP7 unit that had been Unit 5, rebuilt, repaneled, given 460 miles and 3 sets of controlled tests, and a public demonstration in a Detroit parking lot in February cold. She stood there for a moment, looking at it with the focused attention of someone who knew enough about engineering to understand what they were looking at and had been looking at it wrong before. I remember these cars, she said. When the program was running, I drove Unit 1. She paused. It was extraordinary for 12 minutes. Then the thermal system failed and it shut down on the test track. She looked at the rebuilt car. I made the decision to terminate the program because Cole told me the problem couldn't be fixed. I didn't verify that independently. I should have. Ethan didn't say anything. He let her say what she needed to say. He showed me the numbers, projected cost overruns, revised timelines, probability of success analysis. She shook her head slightly. I read the numbers. I didn't ask who had built the analysis or what assumptions it was based on. I just made the call. A lot of decisions get made that way. That's not reassuring. I didn't mean it to be. She looked at him with something he hadn't seen from her before. Genuine wryness, the kind that lives close to the ability to be honest with yourself. No, she said. I suppose you didn't. She looked at the car one more time. Then she walked out. Carolyn reviewed the document over 2 days and came back with 14 points that needed clarification or revision, 3 of which were substantive and the rest of which were the kind of language precision that Carolyn applied to everything. The substantive points concerned the definition of next-generation improvements in the joint development clause. Ethan wanted that language specific enough to prevent Sterling from characterizing incremental applications of the existing technology as joint development that would dilute his IP position, the governance structure for the scholarship program, and a provision in the revenue share clause that Carolyn felt was ambiguous about whether certain commercial applications were included or excluded. Sterling's attorneys made the revisions within 4 business days. 2 of the 3 substantive points came back exactly as Carolyn had specified. The third required a further round of negotiation that took another week and ended with language that Carolyn described as acceptable and that Ethan read twice and agreed with. He signed the agreement on a Thursday morning in Carolyn's conference room, with Priya beside him and Ingrid Sauer on a video call from Chicago. It was not a ceremonial moment. There was no champagne, no photograph, no press release prepared. Carolyn had a notary present, and the signing took about 8 minutes because there were 14 places to sign or initial, and Carolyn walked him through each one explaining what he was executing. When it was done, Carolyn gathered the documents and the notary packed up and left, and it was just Ethan and Priya and Carolyn and Ingrid on the screen. "Congratulations," Ingrid said. Her voice was warm but not effusive. She wasn't an effusive person. "Now the actual work starts." Priya laughed, a short, real laugh. "As opposed to what we've been doing. As opposed to building one car in a garage, now you build a company." "That's terrifying," Priya said. "Yes," Ingrid agreed. "It is." Carolyn poured coffee from the machine on the credenza. She handed Ethan a cup without asking how he wanted it, because she'd seen him make his coffee a sufficient number of times to know. They sat for a moment, the 4 of them, 3 in the room, 1 on a screen, with the signed agreement on the conference table between them. "What are you feeling?" Priya asked him. He thought about it honestly. "Like, I need to call my mother," he said. Priya smiled. Carolyn's expression shifted toward something that was not quite a smile but was warm, which from Carolyn was equivalent. Ingrid on the screen said, "But that's a good instinct." He did call her. Not from the conference room. He went to the hallway outside and sat on a bench near the elevator and called her while the city moved around outside the window of the corridor. Detroit in late February, still cold, still gray, a city that had been through significant things and was still here anyway. His mother picked up on the second ring because she always picked up on the second ring, which he'd never quite figured out. "How did it go?" she asked. "We signed." She was quiet for a moment. So, the 5 broken cars. The 5 broken cars. She made a sound that he'd known his whole life, but not a word, just a sound that meant she was taking something in, sitting with it properly. "What are you going to do with the shop?" "Keep it open." "Mrs. Whitman's car." He had completely forgotten about Mrs. Whitman's car. "I'll call her today." "She called me," his mother said, "last week. She was very polite about it." "I'm sorry." She wasn't angry. She said you seemed like someone with a lot on his plate. He sat with that. Mrs. Whitman, who needed her dead husband's car, kept running, calling his mother to politely inquire about her Volt, because she'd seen enough of the world to recognize when someone had more important things happening and was too decent to make it a complaint. "I'm calling her as soon as I hang up," he said. "Good." His mother was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer rather than a reflexive one, and he gave it the moment it needed. He thought about what happy meant in the specific context of finishing a long, hard thing and standing in the immediate aftermath of it, when the exhaustion and the relief and the awareness of everything that was coming next were all present simultaneously, and none of them was separable from the others. "I think so," he said. "The kind of happy that's also kind of tired and a little scared." "That's the right kind," she said. He called Mrs. Whitman. She was, as his mother had said, entirely gracious about it. She said she hadn't needed the car in the winter anyway, and she said she'd heard some things on the news that suggested Ethan had been occupied with something significant, and she said she hoped it had worked out. He told her she could pick up the car Friday and that he wasn't charging her for the extra time it had been there. She said that wasn't necessary. He said he knew it wasn't necessary, and he was doing it anyway. She thanked him and said she'd see him Friday. He went back to the conference room. Carolyn was reviewing something. Priya was on her phone. Ingrid had signed off. "Mrs. Whitman is coming Friday," he said. Priya looked up. "I forgot about her car." "So did I." "Is she angry?" "No, she's coming Friday." Priya nodded and went back to her phone. Carolyn kept reviewing. The city outside was still cold. The agreement was still on the table. The story about coal broke 11 days later in a piece in the financial press that was based on documents the publication didn't identify the source of, but that Ethan recognized, from the specific details, as coming from people who had been inside the Sterling EP7 program and had been waiting for years for the right moment. The piece described Coal's role in the program's termination in specific terms, named the Korean battery licensing deal, and Coal's compensation from it, and quoted 3 former Sterling engineers on background, saying the program had been viable at the time of its cancellation. Coal's attorney issued a statement describing the piece as defamatory and threatening legal action. The legal action didn't materialize within the timeline his attorney had specified, which was itself a kind of statement. Dennis Farr called Ethan that evening. "You see the piece?" he said. "Yes." "I didn't talk to them." "I know." He did know. He'd recognized the specific details and their specific sources, and Farr wasn't among them. The piece had come from 3 other people, from inside Sterling, from engineers who'd been quiet for 5 years, and had apparently decided that 5 years was enough. "How do you feel about it?" Ethan asked. Farr was quiet for a moment. "Like it's real now," he said. "Like it's not just something I know that nobody else is allowed to know." Another pause. "My wife made dinner. We ate and we watched the news and my kids did homework. It sounds like nothing, but for the last 5 years I've been carrying this thing like—" He stopped. "It sounds like nothing." "It doesn't sound like nothing," Ethan said. Farr's consulting agreement with Cross Motion Research was formalized the following week. It was a real role, not a courtesy title, not a thank you gesture, with defined responsibilities in the joint development framework with Sterling and in the ongoing refinement of the thermal management architecture. Farr had looked at the role description that Priya had drafted and said, with the dry humor of a man who'd been underemployed for years, "This is more interesting than what I've been doing." "You built the foundation," Ethan said. "I'd like you to help build the next floor." Farr had said yes. He said it the way you say yes to something when you've been waiting for someone to ask, without knowing that's what you'd been doing. Cross Motion Research moved into a larger space in March. Not far, 6 blocks north on the same street, a former light manufacturing building with 12,000 square feet that had been vacant for 2 years. Ethan kept the original shop on Livernois open. He'd told his mother he was keeping it, and he meant it. Gerald was still next door, the Coney Island was still on the corner. The vacant lot across the street was still there waiting for summer to make it useful again. He kept one hoist for regular customers, kept Priya's old roll covered with a hire he spent 3 weeks finding carefully, and kept the sign on the door that said Cross Motion Garage, because that's what it was, and that's what it had always been, and the fact that something larger had grown out of it didn't change what it was. The 5 EP7 units, the original 5, the donors, and the casualties of the rebuild, were cleaned and detailed and moved to the new facility, not scrapped, not stored in a corner. Displayed along the main wall of the research floor, each one tagged with its unit number and a brief description of its role in the project. Priya had organized it without being asked. Ethan had come in one morning and found them arranged there, and he'd stood looking at them for a moment without saying anything. "It seemed right," Priya said from behind her desk.
"It is right," he said. They were still broken, most of them. Unit 1 with its caved front fascia, Unit 2 with the empty battery cavity, Unit 3 with its rust lines, Unit 4 missing its door, which was never found. Unit 5, the one that ran, rebuilt, carrying 460 miles in a thermal management system that worked, was up on the end, and even it showed what it had been before it was what it was now. He had been asked, twice in the weeks following the agreement signing, by journalists doing follow-up pieces, whether he felt vindicated. It was a natural question. He understood why they asked it. He'd thought about how to answer it both times and had given slightly different answers, neither of which had fully satisfied him as accurate. The most accurate answer, the one he'd arrived at in the quiet of an early morning about 2 weeks after the signing, was that vindication wasn't quite the right word. Vindication implied that the contest had been between him and the people who'd dismissed him, and that his winning the contest was the point. But the point had never been to prove Victoria Sterling wrong or to outrun Damian Cole's legal tactics or to be the mechanic who beat the corporation. The point had been the work. The point had been the 5 cars and what they contained and the thing that nobody had bothered to finish. The point had been Dennis Farr up at 2 in the morning and 32 engineers who'd spent 4 years building something that deserved to exist in the world. He'd finished it. The work existed. The rest was consequence. One afternoon in late March, he was at the original shop. Alone. Late. The new facility closed for the day. Working on a 2016 Nissan Leaf that belonged to a young woman named Tanisha, who drove for a rideshare company and had explained to him with the frank arithmetic of someone who knew her numbers exactly, that if her car was out of service for more than 4 days, she couldn't cover her rent. He told her 3 days, and he was making it 2. He was under the hood when his phone buzzed. A text from Priya. First scholarship applications are in. 340 of them. He stood up. He read it again. He looked at the text for a moment, then at the shop around him. The tools on the pegboard, the hoist schedule on the wall, the door that said cross-motion garage, the street outside where Detroit was doing what Detroit does in late March, which is begin, slowly and without fanfare, to consider the possibility of spring. He typed back, "Start building the review process. I want to look at them next week." She replied with a single word, "Obviously." He went back to Tanisha's car. He had it ready in 2 days. The first scholarship cohort was selected in April, and the process was nothing like Ethan had imagined it would be, which he supposed was the nature of processes that involve real people rather than plans about real people. He and Priya had built the review criteria carefully over 2 weeks, not just grades, not just test scores, not the conventional metrics that the industry already used and that already produced the same narrow range of candidates the industry had always produced. They were looking for something harder to quantify and easier to recognize when you saw it. The quality of someone's thinking under constraint, how they'd solved problems with the materials available to them, what they'd built or fixed or figured out when the resources weren't there, and they'd done it anyway. The 340 applications had come from 22 states. Ethan read every one of them personally, which Priya had said was going to take too long and which he had done anyway, because the decision felt like one that shouldn't be delegated. He read them in the evenings at the kitchen table, with coffee going cold beside him, and he made notes in the margins the way he made notes in the margins of everything. Small, precise, double underlines when something mattered. By the end of the second week, he'd flagged 63. By the end of the third, he and Priya and Dennis Farr, who had come in for 2 full days to help with the final selection, had it down to 25. The 25th was the one they argued about. Her name was Keziah Oduya. She was 19 from the east side of Cleveland, and her application materials included a transcript from a community college, a letter of recommendation from a mechanic she'd been working for since she was 16, and a technical essay about a hybrid battery management problem she'd diagnosed on a 2014 Chevy Spark that had stumped 3 dealership service centers. The essay was 4 pages long and included hand-drawn circuit diagrams in the margins that were more precise than most of the computer-generated ones Ethan had seen in professional documentation. Farr had flagged her first. Priya had agreed immediately. Ethan had hesitated, not because of the quality of the work, which was clearly there, but because the scholarship was structured around a pipeline to CrossMotion's research positions, And at 19, with a community college background, the gap between where Kezia was and where she'd need to be for that pipeline was real and wasn't going to close on its own. She solves problems with what's in front of her, Farr said. He was sitting across the workbench from Ethan in the new facility, the applications spread between them. Read the essay again. She doesn't have the formal vocabulary yet. She doesn't call it an impedance mismatch. She calls it the part that fights itself. But she's describing an impedance mismatch. She diagnosed it correctly when 3 trained technicians didn't. I know what she did, Ethan said. I'm asking about the gap. The gap is what the scholarship is for. The gap is bigger for her than for most of the others. Priya looked at him. Isn't that exactly the point? He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at the essay again, at the hand-drawn diagrams, at the phrase the part that fights itself, at the note in the mechanic's letter of recommendation that said, she comes in early and stays late, and she asks the right questions, which was 3 things that meant one thing. Yes, he said. That's the point. Kezia was on the list. The cohort notifications went out on a Friday morning. Ethan didn't read the reply emails in real time. Priya managed the responses because if Ethan had been reading them, he wouldn't have gotten anything else done. But Priya showed him one, at the end of that day, from a 22-year-old named Marcus Webb from Flint, no relation to the other Marcus, just the same name, who had written 3 sentences. I've been trying to get into this industry for 4 years. Every door I knocked on told me I didn't have the right background. I didn't expect this one to open. Ethan read it twice. He set his phone down. He went and looked at Unit 1 on the wall for a moment. The caved front fascia, the zip-tied plastic sheeting long since removed, just the bare honest evidence of what it had been. And then he went back to work. The joint vehicle development project with Sterling Automotive began formally in May, which was 8 months after the auction and 5 months after Ethan had driven the rebuilt prototype in a quarter-mile test corridor in a Detroit parking lot with 31 people watching the numbers on a shared display. The project had a name. Internally, it was called the Meridian Program, which was Farr's suggestion, and which Ethan accepted partly because it was a good name and partly because Farr had earned the right to name something. And it had a team, 5 engineers from Sterling's development division, 3 from cross-motion research, Farr in his consulting role bridging both sides, and Priya functioning as operational director of the cross-motion contribution. The first joint team meeting was in the new cross-motion facility, which had been Ethan's condition. He wasn't going to start this in Sterling's building. He'd agreed to the partnership on terms that preserved cross-motion's identity, and the identity was partly physical. It was on Livernois Avenue in Detroit, in a building where you could see the street, in a city that had built more cars than any other city in the history of the world and had been failed by the industry more than once and had kept building anyway. The Sterling engineers arrived in a group, drove in from Jefferson Avenue in 2 company vehicles, and came into the facility with the slightly careful quality of people entering unfamiliar territory where the norms haven't been established yet. They were good people. Ethan had reviewed the personnel selection with Victoria's team and had pushed back on 2 names and accepted the others, and the ones he'd accepted were technically strong and, more importantly, seemed like people who could disagree with him productively. The one he'd pushed back hardest on keeping out was a man named Greg Alford, who had been on the EP7 program's original team and whose departure from Sterling after the cancellation had apparently been acrimonious. Alford had filed a complaint with Sterling's HR department at the time, alleging that the cancellation had been handled improperly. The complaint had been closed without resolution, meaning it had been managed in whatever way the HR department managed things that were connected to people above the HR department's practical authority. Victoria had raised Alford's name. Ethan had listened to her reasoning and then said, I want him to know he's being included because of his work on the original program, not as an accommodation. He'll know, she said. Make sure. Alford came to the first meeting. He was 44, quieter than his file had suggested, with the careful bearing of someone who'd been wrong once about how an institution would treat him, and wasn't going to be wrong again. He looked at the 5 EP7 units on the wall, the way someone looks at something they haven't seen in years and have been thinking about anyway. He looked at them for a long time. After the meeting, when most people had left, he came to Ethan near the north wall. I worked on Unit 3, he said. The battery sealing, that's my work. The sealed module that survived. I know, Ethan said. I use those cells. Alfred looked at Unit 3 on the wall. I spent 3 months on that sealing design. Thermal cycling tests, vibration profiles, moisture, ingress testing. FAR was still on liquid cooling at that point, and I thought we were going to need to protect the cells from the cooling system itself if it failed. He paused. I thought, at least the cells will survive even if everything else fails. Didn't expect them to survive like this. Like what? In someone else's car, 5 years later, running. Ethan didn't say anything. Alfred didn't need him to.
Thank you, Alfred said, for building it, for not just selling it off to Sterling and letting it disappear. The cells helped make it possible, Ethan said. Your 3 months were part of it. Alfred nodded. He went to get his jacket. Outside, it was May in Detroit, and for once, May in Detroit was behaving the way May is supposed to behave. Warm, the trees doing their optimistic thing, the streets drying out from weeks of April rain. The Meridian program ran at a pace that was faster than anyone had projected, which FAR said was a function of building on existing work rather than starting from scratch, and which Ethan thought was also a function of the particular energy that comes when people who've been stopped before are finally allowed to finish. There were arguments, real ones, technical ones, the productive kind that move things forward, about the integration approach, about manufacturing tolerances, about how to adapt the thermal management architecture to the larger battery format needed for Sterling's production vehicle size. Ethan was wrong about 2 things in the first 3 months, wrong enough that FAR caught it, and the discussion was uncomfortable for an afternoon before the right answer emerged. He was used to being wrong and corrected, because that was how bench testing worked. But being wrong in front of a room of engineers who were watching to see how the man who'd built the thing in a garage handled not being right about the thing was different from being wrong alone. He handled it the way he handled everything. He acknowledged it clearly and moved to the correction. The Sterling engineers had their own adjustments. There was a woman on their team named Tamara Vance who was technically exceptional and had a habit of treating decisions as settled once she'd made them, which was an efficient way to move fast and an inefficient way to be right. She and Priya had a sharp exchange in week 6 that Ethan heard from the other side of the facility and chose not to intervene in, partly because Priya didn't need him to intervene, and partly because the exchange needed to happen. By week 8, Tamara and Priya were collaborating on the charge cycle protocol, with the focused intensity of people who'd figured out how the other one thinks. FAR watched all of it with the patience of someone who'd spent 5 years waiting for a room like this to exist. He was good in the joint sessions. He could translate between Sterling's engineering culture and Cross-Motion's scrappier, more empirical approach, and he did it without condescension in either direction, which was harder than it looked. Damian Cole's legal situation resolved publicly in June, which was the month the financial press published a follow-up piece, building on the earlier reporting, now with named sources inside Sterling, that described the internal review findings in substantial detail. The review had confirmed that Cole had commissioned and presented a cost-benefit analysis of the EP7 program using assumptions that were, to put it in the language the article used, not supported by the technical state of the project at the time of its cancellation. The review had further confirmed that Cole had received performance-linked compensation from the Korean battery licensing arrangement that had been established 6 weeks after the EP7 program's termination. Compensation that had not been disclosed to the Sterling board at the time the termination was proposed. Cole resigned from Sterling Automotive, or was said to have resigned, and a separate civil action by Sterling's board seeking to recover the improperly received compensation was proceeding through the courts. Whether it would succeed or what the outcome would be was not something anyone at Cross-Motion was in a position to know or control. The machinery of institutional accountability moves at its own pace, which is often slower than satisfying and sometimes fast enough to matter. Ethan read the financial press piece on a Tuesday morning and put his phone down and drank his coffee. Priya was across the room reviewing test data. FAR was at his desk near the window, which he'd claimed on his second day and which had become his place in the way that people claim places when they intend to stay. "Cole?" Priya said, without looking up from the data. "Yeah. Does it feel like enough?" He thought about Dennis Farr's voice on the phone saying, "It's real now." He thought about Greg Alford looking at Unit 3 on the wall. He thought about 32 engineers who'd spent 4 years in a program that had been closed under them, with 3 months of viable work still to do. It feels like something, he said. Not everything, but something. Priya nodded. She went back to the data. Victoria Sterling called that evening. Not through an assistant, not through an attorney, her direct number, which she'd given him at the end of the signing meeting and which he'd stored in his phone under her full name because he wasn't sure what else to store it under. "Did you see the piece?" she said. "Yes." "How are you feeling about it?" He thought about the question. It was the second time she'd asked him how he was feeling about something, and both times she'd asked it like someone who actually wanted to know, not like someone performing the gesture of asking. He was still calibrating how much of her was performance and how much was the thing underneath, but he was beginning to think the underneath was genuine and more complicated than the surface suggested. "Okay," he said. "You?" A pause. "Honestly, embarrassed that he was in that role for 6 years, that I trusted his assessments without building in the kind of independent verification that would have caught what he was doing." Her voice was steady, but the words had weight in them. "I've been thinking about the engineers on that original team, what it cost them, not just professionally, the years of not knowing if they were wrong or if something else had happened." "Some of them are on the Meridian team now," Ethan said. "I know. They're doing good work." "I know that too." Another pause. "Thank you for telling me." It was a strange thing to thank him for. He wasn't sure why she'd said it, but it seemed genuine, and he let it be what it was. The Meridian program's first production-ready prototype completed its internal testing cycle in October, 11 months after the signing, 24 months almost exactly from the day Ethan had towed 5 broken cars through the rain on a borrowed trailer. It was not the same car he'd built. It was what his car had made possible, scaled, engineered for manufacturing, integrated into a production vehicle architecture that Sterling's team knew how to build and certify and sell. The thermal management system at its core was his. The phase change architecture, the control software logic, the cell communication approach, all of it provisional patented and now full patented and licensed to Sterling and sitting in the heart of a vehicle that would go into production in the following year. He drove the production prototype on a closed test track in southeastern Michigan on a Wednesday in October. It was a gray day, the kind Detroit produces in quantity in October, and the track was a 4-mile loop through flat terrain, and he drove it 6 times at varying speeds and with varying load profiles. The car performed exactly as the Meridian team had projected it would perform, which was to say, it performed at a level that had no direct competition in its market segment. Farr was at the track. He stood near the timing station with his arms crossed and watched the laps with the expression of someone watching something they spent years trying to build finally move under its own power. Alford was there. 3 of the 4 other engineers from the original EP7 team who'd joined the Meridian project were there. The Sterling engineers were there. Priya was there, in the jacket she reserved for occasions that required a jacket, which now by Ethan's count was 4 occasions instead of 3. When he came off the last lap and parked and got out, Farr walked over. They stood next to the car for a moment. "How does it feel?" Farr asked. It was the same question Ethan had asked him once, outside the shop in Detroit in May. "Like finishing something," Ethan said. "Good finish?" "Yeah." He looked at the car. "Good finish." They drove back to Detroit separately. Ethan stopped at the original shop on Livernois on the way back because he did that some evenings, checked in, made sure whoever was closing up had closed up properly, looked at the space the way you look at the thing that started it all, when the thing that started it all is still running and you haven't forgotten what it cost to start it. Gerald was outside the tire shop next door when Ethan pulled in. It was late afternoon and Gerald was locking up, in the methodical way Gerald did everything. "Hey," Gerald said. "Saw something about you on the news this morning." "Yeah?" "Said the car's going into production." "Next year?" Gerald nodded slowly. "You remember when you brought those 5 broke cars back on Marcus's trailer?" "I remember." "I thought—" Gerald stopped. He was a man who chose his words in a way that meant when he said something, it was the thing he actually meant. "I thought you'd lost your mind, to be honest. 5 broke cars for $500. Most people thought that. Did you know, then, what they were?"
Ethan thought about it honestly. I thought they might be something. I didn't know what. That's different from knowing. Yeah. He unlocked the shop door. It is. Gerald went home. Ethan went inside and stood in the shop for a while. The hoist he'd kept was empty. The customer car had been picked up that morning. The tools were on the pegboard.
The coffee machine with the grinding noise had finally been replaced because Priya had replaced it without asking him, 3 months after moving to the new facility. And the new one was quiet and made better coffee, and he'd never admitted to missing the grinding noise, though sometimes he did. He sat at the old workbench and thought about what the story was, now that there was enough of it to see its shape. He had started with a thing that was broken and that everyone with expertise and resources had decided was beyond recovering. He had recovered it not because he had more expertise or more resources than the people who'd given up, but because he looked at broken things differently, not as objects that had failed, but as objects that contained in their failure information about what they'd been trying to do. Every broken system tells you why it broke. If you understand why it broke, you understand what it was trying not to break. If you understand that, you know what it needs. That's mechanics. That's the basic discipline. It's not glamorous. Nobody writes profiles about what mechanics know in the same way they write profiles about what engineers or executives or innovators know, even though the knowledge is real and its application is sophisticated and the consequences of doing it wrong are immediate and physical in a way that most other professional errors aren't. He'd spent his career looking at things other people had given up on. Not because he was special. He was very clear in his own mind that he was not special, that he'd made real errors in the project and been corrected, and had proceeded and made further errors and been corrected again, and that the outcome was not the product of some innate genius, but of a kind of attention that was available to anyone willing to pay it consistently over a long period of time. He'd spent his career in spaces that were not the spaces where the celebrated work happened. A shop on Livernois, a borrowed trailer, a bench testing rig made from salvaged components, 14 months of regular jobs and borrowed money, and a grinding coffee machine. And what he'd learned, or confirmed, or put words to for the first time in the long months of rebuilding 5 cars into one, was this. The things that get thrown away are not always worthless. Sometimes they're the most valuable things in the room. Sometimes they get thrown away because someone made a mistake, or a corrupt calculation, or a decision based on incomplete information, or a judgment formed in the 15 seconds they were willing to spend looking at something before moving on. And when something gets thrown away for those reasons, it doesn't stop being what it was. It waits. It holds its potential the way an object holds heat after the flame goes out. Somebody has to be willing to pick it up. Not just objects. People too. The Kezia Oduyas who can see impedance mismatches and call them the parts that fight themselves and be right. The Dennis Farrs who spent 4 years building something correct and got stopped 3 months before proving it. The Greg Alfords who filed a complaint that went nowhere and showed up anyway, 5 years later, when the door finally opened. The 25 scholarship recipients who had been told, in various ways and by various institutions, that they didn't have the right background, who had kept learning and building and asking the right questions in spaces where nobody was watching. Ethan Cross was not the hero of this story, or at least not in the way the word usually gets used. He was a mechanic who knew how to look at broken things and understand what they were trying to be. He'd done that with 5 cars, and he'd done it with the people around him, and he was going to keep doing it because it was the only kind of work that had ever made sense to him. He was also, now, the founder and operational director of a research company with 12 employees, a licensing agreement with a major automotive corporation, a scholarship program that had given 25 people the first serious institutional support most of them had ever received, and a production vehicle going to market that contained, at its core, a thermal management system he'd developed in an 1,800 square foot shop with 2 hoists and a borrowed come-along. Those things were both true simultaneously, and he was still working on integrating them. The Cross Motion Engineering Academy, which was what the scholarship program had grown into by the time the year ended, with formal curriculum partnerships with 2 community colleges and a mentorship structure Priya had built mostly on her own because she was 27 and had been the kind of person who needed that structure once and hadn't forgotten what it was to need it, held its first full cohort gathering in November at the new facility on Livernois. 23 of the 25 were there. 2 had conflicts. One had a family situation, one had a work scheduling issue that couldn't be moved, and both had sent messages that Priya forwarded to Ethan without comment, which was its own kind of comment. Ethan had agreed to speak to the group, which he'd been nervous about in a way that he hadn't been nervous about the public demonstration or the Sterling meeting or the patent hearings, because those were things he'd prepared for technically, and this was something else. He stood in front of 23 people between the ages of 19 and 27, most of whom had never been in a research facility before, all of whom had applied to a scholarship program on the basis of work they'd done in conditions that weren't set up for them to succeed, and he thought about what he actually wanted to say rather than what sounded right to say. He said this: "I'm not going to tell you that if you work hard enough, anything is possible, because that's not true, and you know it's not true from your own experience. I'm going to tell you something more specific. The industry you're entering has a habit of looking for talent in places it already knows, which means it keeps finding the same talent it already has. That's not because the talent doesn't exist elsewhere. It's because looking in new places is harder than looking in familiar ones, and most institutions don't do hard things unless they have to." He paused. "You're here because someone decided they had to. That someone is partly me and partly Priya and partly the people at Sterling who agreed to fund this, and partly all of you who applied. But the reason this program exists is because the industry was wrong about where to look. Not maliciously wrong, just wrong. And wrong is correctable." He looked at the group. Kezia Oduya was in the third row, in the middle, with the specific quality of attention he'd noticed in her application essay. Completely present, not performing attention, actually paying it. "I built the thing that started this company from 5 cars that everyone said were broken beyond recovery," he said. "They weren't. They were broken in ways that were understandable and fixable by someone who was willing to look at them carefully enough and long enough. That's all I did. I looked carefully, and I looked long enough." He let that sit for a moment. "Some of you are going to find things that the industry has thrown away, and you're going to know what they actually are. Some of you are going to build things that don't exist yet. Some of you are going to identify problems that have been dismissed as unresolvable and find the resolution." He paused. "When that happens, hold on to it. Be methodical. Document everything. Get an attorney." That got a laugh, which was what he'd intended. "And don't let someone who looks at your work for 15 seconds decide what it's worth." Farr was in the room. He was standing near the wall to Ethan's left, and at that last sentence something moved across his face that was brief and real, and which Ethan saw, and which neither of them acknowledged. After the gathering, Kezia Oduya found Ethan near the 5 EP7 units on the wall. She stood looking at them the way everyone stood looking at them, trying to understand what they were before they understood what they'd become. "The one that runs," she said, pointing to Unit 5. "Is that the one from the auction?" "All of them are from the auction," Ethan said. "That one's the primary. The others are donors. Parts came from each of them." She looked at Unit 2, the empty battery cavity, the phase-change thermal architecture partially visible through the open access panel. "I read the EV Tech Review articles," she said, "both of them, when I was applying." She looked at the architecture. "The secondary layer integration. I had to look up what phase change material was. Then I looked it up in 2 more places because I thought I was misunderstanding it." "Were you?" "No." She looked at him directly. "It's a really elegant solution, not complicated elegant, just the simplest thing that works." He looked at the car. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I was going for." "Did you know that's what you were going for when you started?" He thought about it honestly, the same way he'd answered Gerald. "I knew I needed the thermal distribution problem solved. I didn't know phase change material was the path until I took the unit apart and understood what the geometry allowed." He paused. "The solution came from looking at the problem long enough." She thought about that. "My mechanic, the one who wrote my letter, he says something like that. He says the car will tell you what's wrong if you listen to it right." "Your mechanic is right." "He's 72, she said. "He still does everything himself." "Good." "He says young people want the diagnostic computer to tell them the answer before they've thought about the question." She said it in the tone of someone who has had this speech delivered to them multiple times and has absorbed it despite the repetition. He says the computer can confirm. It can't replace knowing. He's still right. She nodded. She looked at the cars one more time, all 5 of them, in sequence, Unit 1 to Unit 5, the broken procession that had become the beginning of something. "Why do you keep them?" she asked. "You could have cleaned them up or stored them." "Because this is what it looked like before," he said. "It's easy to look at something that works and think it was always going to work. The rust and the caved metal and the missing door, that's the honest version. That's what it actually was." She looked at Unit 4, the missing door, the bare interior, the steering column visible from 5 feet away. "I like that," she said simply. The production vehicle, the Sterling Meridian series, launched publicly in February of the following year, 16 months after the signing and 26 months after a rainy Tuesday at a Detroit liquidation auction. The launch event was in Detroit, which had been Ethan's condition in the partnership agreement and which Victoria had agreed to without negotiation, and which meant that for a morning a significant portion of the automotive and technology press was on the east side of Michigan rather than in California or New York, or wherever they usually gathered for things like this. Ethan was not the main speaker at the launch. That was Sterling's event and Sterling's product, and Victoria Sterling gave the keynote with the controlled authority of someone who had been through a hard year and had come out of it with a more honest understanding of what she'd gotten wrong and what was still worth doing. She acknowledged the EP7 program by name. She named the original team and specifically named Farr as the program's lead engineer. She named Ethan and Cross Motion Research as the development partner whose innovation had made the Meridian series possible. She said, with the specific plain language of someone who has decided that plain language is the only kind left worth using, "We abandoned something we shouldn't have abandoned. The people in this room who built it the first time deserved better than what they got. We're trying to do better now. That has to mean something actual, not just something stated." It was not a perfect speech. The phrasing in the middle section was slightly stiff, and there was a moment where she paused a beat too long on a sentence about leadership accountability, which the journalists in the room noted in different ways. But it was honest, and the honesty landed differently than polished would have. Ethan sat in the 4th row. Priya was beside him. Farr was 2 seats over. Marcus was at the end of the row, still in his work clothes because Marcus had come from work and hadn't changed, which was fine because the event had a press pass table staffed by a young woman who had looked at Marcus's name, found it on the list, and handed him the badge without a word about the work clothes. After the event, outside the venue, Ethan stood with Marcus in the February air. The city was behind them. The lake was somewhere beyond the city, frozen, the way it gets in February. "So," Marcus said. "So. That's the car. That's the car." Marcus looked at the display model parked outside the venue, the production Meridian gleaming in the press event lighting, looking like something that had arrived from the future, which, in a way, it had. "Still can't believe you bought 5 broke cars for $500. I keep hearing that because it keeps being true." Marcus looked at him. "The $20,000. I know you paid it back. I want you to know it was a good investment. It was a loan. It was also a good investment." Marcus said it simply. "In you. Turns out that was worth doing." Ethan looked at the car. He thought about the other car, Unit 5, rebuilt, still on the research floor at the Livernois facility alongside its 4 broken siblings, 460 miles on the odometer, and a thermal management system that nobody had believed could work. He thought about the auction parking lot, the rain, $500, the laughter that had drifted back across the asphalt. He didn't feel triumphant about the laughter. He'd stopped feeling triumphant about it somewhere around the time the work got hard enough that the laughter stopped being relevant. What he felt now was something quieter and more durable than triumph. The feeling you get when a thing you did turns out to have mattered in ways that extend past the thing itself, past the car, past the company, past the technology, into the Dennis Farrs and the Kezia Oduyas who'd been stopped or overlooked and were now in rooms where they were being asked to do what they were capable of doing. That was the return on the $500. Not the licensing deal or the production vehicle or the press events. The rooms.
Victoria Sterling found him near the end of the reception, when most of the press had cycled through and the crowd had thinned to the people who were actually there because they cared rather than because they were covering it. She was carrying a drink she hadn't been drinking, and she looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when a large, difficult thing is almost but not quite finished. "How does it feel?" she asked.
"You keep asking me that," he said. "You keep having good answers." He thought about it. "It feels like the beginning of something," he said, "not the end." She looked at the production car and then at him. "That's the right answer," she said. "Because it is." She moved on. He stood there a moment longer. The thing about the right answer is that it's only right if you mean it, and he meant it. The Meridian series going to market was not the end of anything that mattered to him. It was the first consequence of a first decision. To look at 5 broken things and understand what they contained. And consequences compound, the way that interest compounds, the way that thermal energy compounds when the system is working correctly, each cycle building on the previous one. He had a company to build. 25 scholarship recipients to not let down, and 25 more after them. A research floor with 8 engineers working on the next problem, which was the next thermal architecture problem, the one that the Meridian program had surfaced, and that nobody had solved yet because they'd been busy solving the one before it. Farr had a theory about it. Alford had a different theory. They disagreed productively, which was the best condition for theories. He had the original shop on Livernois. He had Mrs. Whitman's car, which had come back to him twice since February with different small problems, and which he had fixed both times with the same careful attention he gave everything, because Mrs. Whitman's dead husband had loved that car, and Mrs. Whitman needed it to keep running, and that mattered as directly and concretely as anything else he'd done in the past 2 years. He drove back to Livernois after the launch event. He stopped at the new facility first. The building was dark. Everyone had left for the event or for home, but he had a key card, and he let himself in and stood in the research space for a moment in the dark with the emergency lighting throwing flat shadows across the equipment and the 5 EP7 units on the wall. He stood with them in the quiet the way you stand with things you've lived alongside for long enough that their presence is part of how you understand where you are. Unit 1, the first. Unit 2, the stripped-out one with the architecture visible. Unit 3, rust and sealed cells. Unit 4, door still missing, still. Unit 5, the one that ran. The world's best opportunities, he had told the scholarship cohort, are often hidden inside the things everyone else is too quick to throw away. He'd meant it when he said it, and he meant it still, with the additional meaning that comes from having lived inside the proof of it for 2 years. He locked up. He walked to his truck. The street was quiet. The Coney Island on the corner was still open. It was always still open. It had been open every night he'd ever needed it to be. And he stopped and got something to eat because he hadn't eaten since morning, and the launch event food had been the catered kind that looks better than it tastes. He sat at the counter and ate, and the cook, who knew him, didn't say anything about the event, or the car, or the press, or any of it. Just put a plate in front of him and refilled his coffee without being asked, and let him sit in the ordinary noise of a Coney Island on a Tuesday night in Detroit. The short order sounds, the television in the corner, 2 guys at a table in the back talking about something that had nothing to do with electric vehicles. It was, he thought, exactly what he needed. He finished eating. He paid. He walked back to his truck in the February air, the city around him doing what cities do when the cameras are gone, and the events are over and the ordinary continuation of things resumes, living, working, failing, trying again, keeping the lights on, getting to Tuesday night. He drove home. He slept. In the morning, he went back to work.